Part 17 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 17, Her Boss, Sections 1 and 2. Paul Wanning opened the front door of his house in Orange, closed it softly behind him, and stood looking about the hall as he drew off his gloves. Nothing was changed there since last night, and yet he stood gazing about him with an interest which a long-married man does not often feel in his own reception-hall. The rugs, the two pillars, the Spanish tapestry chairs were all the same. The Venus de Medici stood on her column as usual, and there at the end of the hall, opposite the front door, was the full-length portrait of Mrs. Wanning, maturely blooming forth in an evening gown, signed with the name of a French painter who seemed purposely to have made his signature indistinct. Though the signature was largely what one paid for, one couldn't ask him to do it over. In the dining-room the colored man was moving about the table set for dinner under the electric cluster. The candles had not yet been lighted. Wanning watched him with a homesick feeling in his heart. They had had Sam a long while, 12 years now. His warm hall, the lighted dining-room, the drawing-room where only the flicker of the wood fire played upon the shining surfaces of many objects, they seemed to Wanning like a haven of refuge. It had never occurred to him that his house was too full of things. He often said, and he believed, that the women of his household had perfect taste. He had paid for these objects, sometimes with difficulty, but always with pride. He carried a heavy life insurance, and permitted himself to spend most of the income from a good law practice. He wished during his lifetime to enjoy the benefits of his wife's discriminating extravagance. Yesterday Wanning's doctor had sent him to a specialist. Today the specialist, after various laboratory tests, had told him most disconcerting things about the state of very necessary but hitherto wholly uninteresting organs of his body. The information pointed to something incredible, insinuated that his residence in this house was only temporary, that he, whose time was so full, might have to leave not only his house and his office and his club, but a world with which he was extremely well satisfied, the only world he knew anything about. Wanning unbuttoned his overcoat, but did not take it off. He stood folding his muffler slowly and carefully. What he did not understand was how he could go while other people stayed. Sam would be moving about the table like this, Mrs. Wanning and her daughters would be dressing upstairs, when he would not be coming home to dinner any more, when he would not indeed be dining anywhere. Sam, coming to turn on the parlor lights, saw Wanning, and stepped behind him to take his coat. "Good evening, Mr. Wanning, sah. Excuse me. You entered so quietly, sah, I didn't hear you." The master of the house slipped out of his coat and went languidly upstairs. He tapped at the door of his wife's room, which stood ajar. "Come in, Paul," she called from her dressing-table. She was seated in a violet dressing-gown, giving the last touches to her coiffure, both arms lifted. They were firm and white, like her neck and shoulders. She was a handsome woman of 55, still a woman, not an old person, Wanning told himself, as he kissed her cheek. She was heavy in figure, to be sure, but she had kept, on the whole, presentable outlines. Her complexion was good, and she wore less false hair than either of her daughters. Wanning himself was 5 years older, but his sandy hair did not show the gray in it, and since his moustache had begun to grow white he kept it clipped so short that it was unobtrusive. His fresh skin made him look younger than he was. Not long ago he had overheard the stenographers in his law office discussing the ages of their employers. They had put him down at 50, agreeing that his two partners must be considerably older than he, which was not the case. Wanning had an especially kindly feeling for the little new girl, a copyist, who had exclaimed that Mr. Wanning couldn't be 50, he seemed so boyish. Wanning lingered behind his wife, looking at her in the mirror. "Well, did you tell the girls, Julia?" he asked, trying to speak casually. Mrs. Wanning looked up and met his eyes in the glass. "The girls?" She noticed a strange expression come over his face. "About your health, you mean?" "Yes, dear, but I tried not to alarm them. They feel dreadfully. I'm going to have a talk with Dr. Sears myself. These specialists are all alarmists, and I've often heard of his frightening people." She rose and took her husband's arm, drawing him toward the fireplace. "You are not going to let this upset you, Paul. If you take care of yourself, everything will come out all right. You have always been so strong. One has only to look at you." "Did you," Wanning asked, "say anything to Harold?" "Yes, of course. I saw him in town to-day, and he agrees with me that Sears draws the worst conclusions possible. He says even the young men are always being told the most terrifying things. Usually they laugh at the doctors and do as they please. You certainly don't look like a sick man, and you don't feel like one, do you?" She patted his shoulder, smiled at him encouragingly, and rang for the maid to come and hook her dress. When the maid appeared at the door, Wanning went out through the bathroom to his own sleeping chamber. He was too much dispirited to put on a dinner coat, though such remissness was always noticed. He sat down and waited for the sound of the gong, leaving his door open on the chance that perhaps one of his daughters would come in. When Wanning went down to dinner, he found his wife already at her chair and the table laid for four. "Harold," she explained, "is not coming home. He has to attend a first night in town." A moment later their two daughters entered, obviously dressed. They both wore earrings and masses of hair. The daughters' names were Roma and Florence. Roma Fiorenza, one of the young men who came to the house often, but not often enough, had called them. Tonight they were going to a rehearsal of The Dances of the Nations, a benefit performance in which Miss Roma was to lead the Spanish dances, her sister the Grecian. The elder daughter had often been told that her name suited her admirably. She looked indeed, as we are apt to think the unrestrained beauties of later Rome must have looked, but as their portrait busts emphatically declare they did not. Her head was massive, her lips full and crimson, her eyes large and heavy-lidded, her forehead low. At costume balls and in living pictures she was always Semiramis, or Poppaea, or Theodora. Barbaric accessories brought out something cruel and even rather brutal in her handsome face. The men who were attracted to her were somehow afraid of her. Florence was slender, with a long, graceful neck, a restless head, and a flexible mouth. Discontent lurked about the corners of it. Her shoulders were pretty, but her neck and arms were too thin. Roma was always struggling to keep within a certain weight. Her chin and upper arms grew persistently more solid, and Florence was always striving to attain a certain weight. Wanning used sometimes to wonder why these disconcerting fluctuations could not go the other way, why Roma could not melt away as easily as did her sister, who had to be sent to Palm Beach to save the precious pounds. "I don't see why you ever put Ricky Allan in charge of the English country dances," Florence said to her sister as they sat down. "He knows the figures, of course, but he has no real style." Roma looked annoyed. Ricky Allan was one of the men who came to the house almost often enough. "He is absolutely to be depended upon, that's why," she said firmly. "I think he is just right for it, Florence," put in Mrs. Wanning. "It's remarkable he should feel that he can give up the time. Such a busy man. He must be very much interested in the movement." Florence's lip curled drolly under her soup-spoon. She shot an amused glance at her mother's dignity. "Nothin' doing," her keen eyes seemed to say. Though Florence was nearly 30 and her sister a little beyond, there was, seriously, nothing doing. With so many charms and so much preparation, they never, as Florence vulgarly said, quite pulled it off. They had been rushed time and again, and Mrs. Wanning had repeatedly steeled herself to bear the blow. But the young men went to follow a career in Mexico or the Philippines, or moved to Yonkers, and escaped without a mortal wound. Roma turned graciously to her father. "I met Mr. Lane at the Holland House to-day, where I was lunching with the Burtons, father. He asked about you, and when I told him you were not so well as usual, he said he would call you up. He wants to tell you about some doctor he discovered in Iowa who cures everything with massage and hot water. It sounds freakish, but Mr. Lane is a very clever man, isn't he?" "Very," assented Wanning. "I should think he must be," sighed Mrs. Wanning. "How in the world did he make all that money, Paul? He didn't seem especially promising years ago, when we used to see so much of them." "Corporation business. He's attorney for the P.L.&G.," murmured her husband. "What a pile he must have!" Florence watched the old negro's slow movements with restless eyes. "Here is Jenny, a Contessa, with a glorious palace in Genoa that her father must have bought her. Surely Aldrini had nothing. Have you seen the baby count's pictures, Roma? They're very cunning. I should think you'd go to Genoa and visit Jenny." "We must arrange that, Roma. It's such an opportunity." Though Mrs. Wanning addressed her daughter, she looked at her husband. "You would get on so well among their friends. When Count Aldrini was here you spoke Italian much better than poor Jenny. I remember when we entertained him, he could scarcely say anything to her at all." Florence tried to call up an answering flicker of amusement upon her sister's calm, well-bred face. She thought her mother was rather outdoing herself to-night. Since Aldrini had at least managed to say the one important thing to Jenny, somehow, somewhere. Jenny Lane had been Roma's friend and schoolmate, and the Count was an ephemeral hope in Orange. Mrs. Wanning was one of the first matrons to declare that she had no prejudices against foreigners, and at the dinners that were given for the Count, Roma was always put next to him to act as interpreter. Roma again turned to her father. "If I were you, dear, I would let Mr. Lane tell me about his doctor. New discoveries are often made by queer people." Roma's voice was low and sympathetic. She never lost her dignity. Florence asked if she might have her coffee in her room, while she dashed off a note, and she ran upstairs humming "Bright Lights," and wondering how she was going to stand her family until the summer scattering. Why should Roma never throw off her elegant reserve, and call things by their names? She sometimes thought she might like her sister if she would only come out in the open and howl about her disappointments. Roma, drinking her coffee deliberately, asked her father if they might have the car early, as they wanted to pick up Mr. Allan and Mr. Rydberg on their way to rehearsal. Wanning said certainly. Heaven knew he was not stingy about his car, though he could never quite forget that in his day it was the young men who used to call for the girls when they went to rehearsals. "You are going with us, Mother?" Roma asked as they rose. "I think so, dear. Your father will want to go to bed early, and I shall sleep better if I go out. I am going to town to-morrow to pour tea for Harold. We must get him some new silver, Paul. I am quite ashamed of his spoons." Harold, the only son, was a playwright, as yet unproduced, and he had a studio in Washington Square. A half-hour later Wanning was alone in his library. He would not permit himself to feel aggrieved. What was more commendable than a mother's interest in her children's pleasures? Moreover, it was his wife's way of following things up, of never letting die-grass grow under her feet, that had helped to push him along in the world. She was more ambitious than he. That had been good for him. He was naturally indolent, and Julia's childlike desire to possess material objects, to buy what other people were buying, had been the spur that made him go after business. It had, moreover, made his house the attractive place he believed it to be. Suppose, his wife sometimes said to him when the bills came in from Celeste or Madame Blanche, suppose you had homely daughters, how would you like that? He wouldn't have liked it. When he went anywhere with his three ladies, Wanning always felt very well done by. He had no complaint to make about them, or about anything. That was why it seemed so unreasonable. He felt along his back incredulously with his hand. Harold, of course, was a trial, but among all his business friends he knew scarcely one who had a promising boy. The house was so still that Wanning could hear a faint metallic tinkle from the butler's pantry. Old Sam was washing up the silver, which he put away himself every night. Wanning rose and walked aimlessly down the hall and out through the dining-room. "Any Apollinaris on ice, Sam? I'm not feeling very well tonight." The old colored man dried his hands. "Yassa, Mr. Wanning. Have a little rye with it, sah?" "No, thank you, Sam. That's one of the things I can't do any more. I've been to see a big doctor in the city, and he tells me there's something seriously wrong with me. My kidneys has sort of gone back on me." It was a satisfaction to Wanning to name the organ that had betrayed him, while all the rest of him was so sound. Sam was immediately interested. He shook his grizzled head and looked full of wisdom. "Don't seem like a gentleman of such a temperate life ought to have anything wrong thar, sir." "No, it doesn't, does it?" Wanning leaned against the china closet and talked to Sam for nearly half an hour. The specialist who condemned him hadn't seemed half so much interested. There was not a detail about the examination and the laboratory tests in which Sam did not show the deepest concern. He kept asking Wanning if he could remember straining himself when he was a young man. "I've knowed a strain like that to sleep in a man for years and years, and then come back on him, 'deed I have," he said mysteriously. "And again, it might be you got a floatin' kidney, sir. After dey once tear loose, dey sometimes don't make no trouble for quite a while." When Wanning went to his room, he did not go to bed. He sat up until he heard the voices of his wife and daughters in the hall below. His own bed somehow frightened him. In all the years he had lived in this house, he had never before looked about his room at that bed with the thought that he might one day be trapped there and might not get out again. He had been ill, of course, but his room had seemed a particularly pleasant place for a sick man. Sunlight, flowers, agreeable, well-dressed women coming in and out. Now there was something sinister about the bed itself, about its position and its relation to the rest of the furniture. 2. The next morning, on his way downtown, Wanning got off the subway train at Astor Place and walked over to Washington Square. He climbed 3 flights of stairs and knocked at his son's studio. Harold, dressed, with his stick and gloves in his hand, opened the door. He was just going over to the Brevoort for breakfast. He greeted his father with the cordial familiarity practiced by all the boys of his set, clapped him on the shoulder, and said in his light tonsillitis voice, "Come in, Governor. How delightful! I haven't had a call from you in a long time." He threw his hat and gloves on the writing-table. He was a perfect gentleman, even with his father. Florence said the matter with Harold was that he had heard people say he looked like Byron, and stood for it. What Harold would stand for in such matters was indeed the best definition of him. When he read his play, The Street Walker, in drawing-rooms, and one lady told him it had the poetic symbolism of Chekhov, and another said it suggested the biting realism of Brieux, he never, in his most secret thoughts, questioned the acumen of either lady. Harold's speech, even if you heard it in the next room and could not see him, told you that he had no sense of the absurd, a throaty staccato with never a downward inflection, trustfully striving to please. "Just going out?" his father asked. "I won't keep you. Your mother told you I had a discouraging session with Sears?" "So awfully sorry you've had this bother, Governor. Just as sorry as I can be. No question about its coming out all right, but it's a downright nuisance, your having to diet and that sort of thing. And I suppose you ought to follow directions, just to make us all feel comfortable, oughtn't you?" Harold spoke with fluent sympathy. Wanning sat down on the arm of a chair and shook his head. Yes, they do recommend a diet, but they don't promise much from it." Harold laughed precipitately. "Delicious! All doctors are, aren't they? So profound and oracular. The medicine man. It's quite the same idea, you see, with tom-toms." Wanning knew that Harold meant something subtle, one of the subtleties which he said were only spoiled by being explained, so he came bluntly to one of the issues he had in mind. "I would like to see you settled before I quit the harness, Harold." Harold was absolutely tolerant. He took out his cigarette case and burnished it with his handkerchief. "I perfectly understand your point of view, dear Governor, but perhaps you don't altogether get mine. Isn't it so? I am settled. What you mean by being settled would unsettle me completely. I'm cut out for just such an existence as this. To live 4 floors up in an attic, get my own breakfast, and have a charwoman to do for me. I should be awfully bored with an establishment. I'm quite content with a little diggings like this." Wanning's eyes fell. Somebody had to pay the rent for even such modest quarters as contented Harold, but to say so would be rude, and Harold himself was never rude. Wanning did not, this morning, feel equal to hearing a statement of his son's uncommercial ideals. "I know," he said hastily, "but now we're up against hard facts, my boy. I did not want to alarm your mother, but I've had a time limit put on me, and it's not a very long one." Harold threw away the cigarette he had just lighted in a burst of indignation. "That's the sort of thing I consider criminal, father, absolutely criminal. What doctor has a right to suggest such a thing? Sears himself may be knocked out to-morrow. What have laboratory tests got to do with a man's will to live? The force of that depends upon his entire personality, not on any organ or pair of organs." Harold thrust his hands in his pockets and walked up and down, very much stirred. "Really, I have a very poor opinion of scientists. They ought to be made serve an apprenticeship in art to get some conception of the power of human motives. Such brutality!" Harold's plays dealt with the grimmest and most depressing matters, but he himself was always agreeable, and he insisted upon high cheerfulness as the correct tone of human intercourse. Wanning rose and turned to go. There was, in Harold, simply no reality to which one could break through. The young man took up his hat and gloves. "Must you go? Let me step along with you to the sub. The walk will do me good." Harold talked agreeably all the way to Astor Place. His father heard little of what he said, but he rather liked his company and his wish to be pleasant. Wanning went to his club for luncheon, meaning to spend the afternoon with some of his friends who had retired from business and who read the papers there in the empty hours between 2 and 7. He got no satisfaction, however. When he tried to tell these men of his present predicament, they began to describe ills of their own in which he could not feel interested. Each one of them had a treacherous organ of which he spoke with animation, almost with pride, as if it were a crafty business competitor whom he was constantly outwitting. Each had a doctor, too, for whom he was ardently soliciting business. They wanted either to telephone their doctor and make an appointment for Wanning, or to take him then and there to the consulting room. When he did not accept these invitations, they lost interest in him and remembered engagements. He called a taxi and returned to the offices of McQuiston, Wade and Wanning. Settled at his desk, Wanning decided that he would not go home to dinner, but would stay at the office and dictate a long letter to an old college friend who lived in Wyoming. He could tell Douglas Brown things that he had not succeeded in getting to anyone else. Brown, out in the Wind River Mountains, couldn't defend himself, couldn't slap Wanning on the back and tell him to gather up the sunbeams. He called up his house in Orange to say that he would not be home until late. Roma answered the telephone. He spoke mournfully, but she was not disturbed by it. "Very well, father. Don't get too tired," she said in her well-modulated voice. When Wanning was ready to dictate his letter, he looked out from his private office into the reception room and saw that his stenographer, in her hat and gloves and furs of the newest cut, was just leaving. "Good night, Mr. Wanning," she said, drawing down her dotted veil. Had there been important business letters to be got off on the night mail, he would have felt that he could detain her, but not for anything personal. Miss Doane was an expert legal stenographer, and she knew her value. The slightest delay in dispatching office business annoyed her. Letters that were not signed until the next morning awoke her deepest contempt. She was scrupulous in professional etiquette, and Wanning felt that their relations, though pleasant, were scarcely cordial. As Miss Doane's trim figure disappeared through the outer door, little Annie Woolley, the copyist, came in from the stenographer's room. Her hat was pinned over one ear, and she was scrambling into her coat as she came, holding her gloves in her teeth and her battered handbag in the fist that was already through a sleeve. "Annie, I want to dictate a letter. You were just leaving, weren't you?" "Oh, I don't mind," she answered cheerfully, and pulling off her old coat threw it on a chair. "I'll get my book." She followed him into his room and sat down by a table, though she wrote with her book on her knee. Wanning had several times kept her after office hours to take his private letters for him, and she had always been good-natured about it. On each occasion, when he gave her $1 to get her dinner, she protested, laughing, and saying that she could never eat so much as that. She seemed a happy sort of little creature, didn't pout when she was scolded, and giggled about her own mistakes in spelling. She was plump and undersized, always dodging under the elbows of taller people, and clattering about on high heels, much run over. She had bright black eyes and fuzzy black hair, in which, despite Miss Doane's reprimands, she often stuck her pencil. She was the girl who couldn't believe that Wanning was 50, and he had liked her ever since he overheard that conversation. Tilting back his chair (he never assumed this position when he dictated to Miss Doane), Wanning began, "To Mr. D. E. Brown, South Forks, Wyoming." He shaded his eyes with his hand and talked off a long letter to this man who would be sorry that his mortal frame was breaking up. He recalled to him certain fine months they had spent together on the Wind River when they were young men, and said he sometimes wished that, like D. E. Brown, he had claimed his freedom in a big country where the wheels did not grind a man as hard as they did in New York. He had spent all these years hustling about and getting ready to live the way he wanted to live, and now he had a puncture the doctors couldn't mend. What was the use of it? Wanning's thoughts were fixed on the trout streams and the great silver firs in the canyons of the Wind River Mountains, when he was disturbed by a soft, repeated sniffling. He looked out between his fingers. Little Annie, carried away by his eloquence, was fairly panting to make dots and dashes fast enough, and she was sopping her eyes with an unpresentable end-of-the-day handkerchief. Wanning rambled on in his dictation. Why was she crying? What did it matter to her? He was a man who said good morning to her, who sometimes took an hour of the precious few she had left at the end of the day, and then complained about her bad spelling. When the letter was finished, he handed her a new $2 bill. "I haven't got any change to-night, and anyhow I'd like you to eat a whole lot. I'm on a diet, and I want to see everybody else eat." Annie tucked her notebook under her arm and stood looking at the bill, which she had not taken up from the table. "I don't like to be paid for taking letters to your friends, Mr. Wanning," she said impulsively. "I can run personal letters off between times. It ain't as if I needed the money," she added carelessly. "Oh, get along with you. Anybody who is 18 years old and has a sweet tooth needs money, all they can get." Annie giggled and darted out with the bill in her hand. Wanning strolled aimlessly after her into the reception room. "Let me have that letter before lunch to-morrow, please, and be sure that nobody sees it." He stopped and frowned. "I don't look very sick, do I?" "I should say you don't." Annie got her coat on after considerable tugging. "Why don't you call in a specialist? My mother called a specialist for my father before he died." "Oh, is your father dead?" "I should say he is. He was a painter by trade, and he fell off a 70-foot stack into the East River. Mother couldn't get anything out of the company because he wasn't buckled. He lingered for 4 months, so I know all about taking care of sick people. I was attending business college then, and sick as he was, he used to give me dictation for practice. He made us all go into professions, the girls, too. He didn't like us to just run." Wanning would have liked to keep Annie and hear more about her family, but it was nearly 7 o'clock, and he knew he ought, in mercy, to let her go. She was the only person to whom he had talked about his illness who had been frank and honest with him, who had looked at him with eyes that concealed nothing. When he broke the news of his condition to his partners that morning, they shut him off as if he were uttering indecent ravings. All day they had met him with a hurried, abstracted manner. McQuiston and Wade went out to lunch together, and he knew what they were thinking, perhaps talking about. Wanning had brought into the firm valuable business, but he was less enterprising than either of his partners. End of Part 17. Part 18 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 18, Her Boss, Sections 3 and 4. In the early summer, Wanning's family scattered. Roma swallowed her pride and sailed for Genoa to visit the Contessa Jenny. Harold went to Cornish to be in an artistic atmosphere. Mrs. Wanning and Florence took a cottage at York Harbour, where Wanning was supposed to join them whenever he could get away from town. He did not often get away. He felt most at ease among his accustomed surroundings. He kept his car in the city, and went back and forth from his office to the club where he was living. Old Sam, his butler, came in from Orange every night to put his clothes in order and make him comfortable. Wanning began to feel that he would not tire of his office in 100 years. Although he did very little work, it was pleasant to go downtown every morning when the streets were crowded, the sky clear, and the sunshine bright. From the windows of his private office he could see the harbour and watch the ocean liners come down the North River and go out to sea. While he read his mail, he often looked out and wondered why he had been so long indifferent to that extraordinary scene of human activity and hopefulness. How had a short-lived race of beings the energy and courage valiantly to begin enterprises which they could follow for only a few years? To throw up towers and build sea monsters and found great businesses, when the frailest of the materials with which they worked, the paper upon which they wrote, the ink upon their pens, had more permanence in this world than they. All this material rubbish lasted. The linen clothing and cosmetics of the Egyptians had lasted. It was only the human flame that certainly went out. Other things had a fighting chance. They might meet with mishap and be destroyed. They might not. But the human creature who gathered and shaped and hoarded and foolishly loved these things, he had no chance, absolutely none. Wanning's cane, his hat, his top-coat might go from beggar to beggar and knock about in this world for another 50 years or so. But not he. In the late afternoon he never hurried to leave his office now. Wonderful sunsets burned over the North River. Wonderful stars trembled up among the towers, more wonderful than anything he could hurry away to. One of his windows looked directly down upon the spire of Old Trinity, with the green churchyard and the pale sycamores far below. Wanning often dropped into the church when he was going out to lunch, not because he was trying to make his peace with heaven, but because the church was old and restful and familiar, because it and its gravestones had sat in the same place for a long while. He bought flowers from the street boys and kept them on his desk, which his partners thought strange behavior, and which Miss Doane considered a sign that he was failing. But there were graver things than bouquets for Miss Doane and the senior partner to ponder over. The senior partner, McQuiston, in spite of his silvery hair and moustache and his important church connections, had rich natural taste for scandal. After Mr. Wade went away for his vacation in May, Wanning took Annie Woolley out of the copying room, put her at a desk in his private office, and raised her pay to $18 a week, explaining to McQuiston that for the summer months he would need a secretary. This explanation satisfied neither McQuiston nor Miss Doane. Annie was also paid for overtime, and although Wanning attended to very little of the office business now, there was a great deal of overtime. Miss Doane was, of course, above questioning a chit like Annie, but what was he doing with his time and his new secretary, she wanted to know. If anyone had told her that Wanning was writing a book, she would have said bitterly that it was just like him. In his youth Wanning had hankered for the pen. When he studied law, he had intended to combine that profession with some tempting form of authorship. Had he remained a bachelor, he would have been an unenterprising literary lawyer to the end of his days. It was his wife's restlessness and her practical turn of mind that had made him a money-getter. His illness seemed to bring back to him the illusions with which he left college. As soon as his family were out of the way and he shut up the Orange House, he began to dictate his autobiography to Annie Woolley. It was not only the story of his life, but an expression of all his theories and opinions, and a commentary on the 50 years of events which he could remember. Fortunately, he was able to take great interest in this undertaking. He had the happiest convictions about the clear-cut style he was developing and his increasing felicity in phrasing. He meant to publish the work handsomely, at his own expense, and under his own name. He rather enjoyed the thought of how greatly disturbed Harold would be. He and Harold differed in their estimates of books. All the solid works which made up Wanning's library Harold considered beneath contempt. Anybody, he said, could do that sort of thing. When Wanning could not sleep at night, he turned on the light beside his bed and made notes on the chapter he meant to dictate the next day. When he returned to the office after lunch, he gave instructions that he was not to be interrupted by telephone calls, and shut himself up with his secretary. After he had opened all the windows and taken off his coat, he fell to dictating. He found it a delightful occupation, the solace of each day. Often he had sudden fits of tiredness. Then he would lie down on the leather sofa and drop asleep, while Annie read The Leopard Spots until he woke. Like many another businessman, Wanning had relied so long on stenographers that the operation of writing with a pen had become laborious to him. When he undertook it, he wanted to cut everything short. But walking up and down his private office, with the strong afternoon sun pouring in at his windows, a fresh air stirring, all the people and boats moving restlessly down there, he could say things he wanted to say. It was like living his life over again. He did not miss his wife or his daughters. He had become again the mild, contemplative youth he was in college, before he had a profession and a family to grind for, before the two needs which shape our destiny had made of him pretty much what they make of every man. At 5 o'clock Wanning sometimes went out for a cup of tea and took Annie along. He felt dull and discouraged as soon as he was alone. So long as Annie was with him, he could keep a grip on his own thoughts. They talked about what he had just been dictating to her. She found that he liked to be questioned, and she tried to be greatly interested in it all. After tea they went back to the office. Occasionally Wanning lost track of time, and kept Annie until it grew dark. He knew he had old McQuiston guessing, but he didn't care. One day the senior partner came to him with a reproving air. "I am afraid Miss Doane is leaving us, Paul. She feels that Miss Woolley's promotion is irregular." "How is that any business of hers, I'd like to know? She has all my legal work. She is always disagreeable enough about doing anything else." McQuiston's puffy red face went a shade darker. "Miss Doane has a certain professional pride, a strong feeling for office organization. She doesn't care to fill an equivocal position. I don't know that I blame her. She feels that there is something not quite regular about the confidence you seem to place in this inexperienced young woman." Wanning pushed back his chair. "I don't care a hang about Miss Doane's sense of propriety. I need a stenographer who will carry out my instructions. I've carried out Miss Doane's long enough. I've let that schoolma'am hector me for years. She can go when she pleases." That night McQuiston wrote to his partner that things were in a bad way, and they would have to keep an eye on Wanning. He had been seen at the theatre with his new stenographer. That was true. Wanning had several times taken Annie to the Palace on Saturday afternoon. When all his acquaintances were off motoring or playing golf, when the downtown offices and even the streets were deserted, it amused him to watch a foolish show with a delighted, cheerful little person beside him. Beyond her generosity, Annie had no shining merits of character, but she had the gift of thinking well of everything, and wishing well. When she was there, Wanning felt as if there were someone who cared whether this was a good or a bad day with him. Old Sam, too, was like that. While the old black man put him to bed and made him comfortable, Wanning could talk to him as he talked to little Annie. Even if he dwelt upon his illness, in plain terms, in detail, he did not feel as if he were imposing on them. People like Sam and Annie admitted misfortune, admitted it almost cheerfully. Annie and her family did not consider illness or any of its hard facts vulgar or indecent. It had its place in their scheme of life, as it had not in that of Wanning's friends. Annie came out of a typical poor family of New York. Of 8 children, only 4 lived to grow up. In such families the stream of life is broad enough, but runs shallow. In the children, vitality is exhausted early. The roots do not go down into anything very strong. Illness and deaths and funerals in her own family and in those of her friends had come at frequent intervals in Annie's life. Since they had to be, she and her sisters made the best of them. There was something to be got out of funerals even, if they were managed right. They kept people in touch with old friends who had moved uptown and revived kindly feelings. Annie had often given up things she wanted because there was sickness at home, and now she was patient with her boss. What he paid her for overtime work by no means made up to her what she lost. Annie was not in the least thrifty, nor were any of her sisters. She had to make a living, but she was not interested in getting all she could for her time, or in laying up for the future. Girls like Annie know that the future is a very uncertain thing, and they feel no responsibility about it. The present is what they have, and it is all they have. If Annie missed a chance to go sailing with the plumber's son on Saturday afternoon, why, she missed it. As for the $2 her boss gave her, she handed them over to her mother. Now that Annie was getting more money, one of her sisters quit a job she didn't like and was staying at home for a rest. That was all promotion meant to Annie. The first time Annie's boss asked her to work on Saturday afternoon, she could not hide her disappointment. He suggested that they might knock off early and go to a show, or take a run in his car, but she grew tearful and said it would be hard to make her family understand. Wanning thought perhaps he could explain to her mother. He called his motor and took Annie home. When his car stopped in front of the tenement house on 8th Avenue, heads came popping out of the windows for 6 stories up, and all the neighbor women, in dressing sacks and wrappers, gazed down at the machine and at the couple alighting from it. A motor meant a wedding, or the hospital. The plumber's son, Willie Steen, came over from the corner saloon to see what was going on, and Annie introduced him at the doorstep. Mrs. Woolley asked Wanning to come into the parlor and invited him to have a chair of ceremony between the folding bed and the piano. Annie, nervous and tearful, escaped to the dining-room, the cheerful spot where the daughters visited with each other and with their friends. The parlor was a masked sleeping-chamber and store-room. The plumber's son sat down on the sofa beside Mrs. Woolley, as if he were accustomed to share in the family councils. Mrs. Woolley waited expectant and kindly. She looked the sensible, hard-working woman that she was, and one could see she hadn't lived all her life on Eighth Avenue without learning a great deal. Wanning explained to her that he was writing a book which he wanted to finish during the summer months when business was not so heavy. He was ill and could not work regularly. His secretary would have to take his dictation when he felt able to give it, must, in short, be a sort of companion to him. He would like to feel that she could go out in his car with him, or even to the theatre when he felt like it. It might have been better if he had engaged a young man for this work, but since he had begun it with Annie, he would like to keep her if her mother was willing. Mrs. Woolley watched him with friendly, searching eyes. She glanced at Willie Steen, who, wise in such distinctions, had decided that there was nothing shady about Annie's boss. He nodded his sanction. "I don't want my girl to conduct herself in any such way as will prejudice her, Mr. Wanning," she said thoughtfully. "If you've got daughters, you know how that is. You've been liberal with Annie, and it's a good position for her. It's right she should go to business every day, and I want her to do her work right. But I like to have her home after working hours. I always think a young girl's time is her own after business hours, and I try not to burden them when they come home. I'm willing she should do your work as suits you, if it's her wish. But I don't like to press her. The good times she misses now, it's not you nor me, sir, that can make them up to her. These young things has their feelings." "Oh, I don't want to press her either," Wanning said hastily. "I simply want to know that you understand the situation. I've made her a little present in my will as a recognition that she is doing more for me than she is paid for." "That's something above me, sir. We'll hope there won't be no question of wills for many years yet." Mrs. Woolley spoke heartily. "I'm glad if my girl can be of any use to you, just so she don't prejudice herself." The plumber's son rose as if the interview were over. "It's all right, Mamma Woolley, don't you worry," he said. He picked up his canvas cap and turned to Wanning. "You see, Annie ain't the sort of girl that would want to be spotted circulating around with a moneyed party her folks didn't know all about. She'd lose friends by it." After this conversation, Annie felt a great deal happier. She was still shy and a trifle awkward with poor Wanning when they were outside the office building, and she missed the old freedom of her Saturday afternoons. But she did the best she could, and Willie Steen tried to make it up to her. In Annie's absence he often came in of an afternoon to have a cup of tea and a sugar bun with Mrs. Woolley and the daughter, who was resting. As they sat at the dining-room table, they discussed Annie's employer, his peculiarities, his health, and what he had told Mrs. Woolley about his will. Mrs. Woolley said she sometimes felt afraid he might disinherit his children, as rich people often did, and make talk. But she hoped for the best. Whatever came to Annie, she prayed it might not be in the form of taxable property. 4. Late in September, Wanning grew suddenly worse. His family hurried home, and he was put to bed in his house in Orange. He kept asking the doctors when he could get back to the office, but he lived only 8 days. The morning after his father's funeral, Harold went to the office to consult Wanning's partners and to read the will. Everything in the will was as it should be. There were no surprises except a codicil in the form of a letter to Mrs. Wanning, dated July 8th, requesting that out of the estate she should pay the sum of $1,000 to his stenographer, Annie Woolley, in recognition of her faithful services. "I thought Miss Doane was my father's stenographer," Harold exclaimed. Alec McQuiston looked embarrassed and spoke in a low, guarded tone. "She was, for years, but this spring—" He hesitated. McQuiston loved a scandal. He leaned across his desk toward Harold. "This spring your father put this little girl, Miss Woolley, a copyist, utterly inexperienced, in Miss Doane's place. Miss Doane was indignant and left us. The change made comment here in the office. It was slightly—no, I will be frank with you, Harold, it was very irregular." Harold also looked grave. What could my father have meant by such a request as this to my mother? The silver-haired senior partner flushed and spoke as if he were trying to break something gently. "I don't understand it, my boy, but I think, indeed I prefer to think, that your father was not quite himself all this summer. A man like your father does not, in his right senses, find pleasure in the society of an ignorant, common little girl. He does not make a practice of keeping her at the office after hours, often until 8 o'clock, or take her to restaurants and to the theatre with him. Not, at least, in a slanderous city like New York." Harold flinched before McQuiston's meaning gaze and turned aside in pained silence. He knew, as a dramatist, that there are dark chapters in all men's lives, and this but too clearly explained why his father had stayed in town all summer instead of joining his family. McQuiston asked if he should ring for Annie Woolley. Harold drew himself up. "No. Why should I see her? I prefer not to. But, with your permission, Mr. McQuiston, I will take charge of this request to my mother. It could only give her pain, and might awaken doubts in her mind." "We hardly know," murmured the senior partner, "where an investigation would lead us. Technically, of course, I cannot agree with you. But if, as one of the executors of the will, you wish to assume personal responsibility for this bequest, under the circumstances, well, irregularities beget irregularities." "My first duty to my father," said Harold, "is to protect my mother." That afternoon McQuiston called Annie Woolley into his private office and told her that her services would not be needed any longer, and that in lieu of notice the clerk would give her 2 weeks' salary. "Can I call up here for references?" Annie asked. "Certainly, but you had better ask for me personally. You must know there has been some criticism of you here in the office, Miss Woolley." "What about?" Annie asked boldly. "Well, a young girl like you cannot render so much personal service to her employer as you did to Mr. Wanning without causing unfavourable comment. To be blunt with you, for your own good, my dear young lady, your services to your employer should terminate in the office and at the close of office hours. Mr. Wanning was a very sick man, and his judgment was at fault. But you should have known what a girl in your station can do and what she cannot do." The vague discomfort of months flashed up in little Annie. She had no mind to stand by and be lectured without having a word to say for herself. "Of course he was sick, poor man," she burst out. "Not as anybody seemed much upset about it. I wouldn't have given up my half-holidays for anybody if they hadn't been sick, no matter what they paid me. There wasn't anything in it for me." McQuiston raised his hand warningly. "That will do, young lady. But when you get another place, remember this: it is never your duty to entertain or to provide amusement for your employer." He gave Annie a look which she did not clearly understand, although she pronounced him a nasty old man as she hustled on her hat and jacket. When Annie reached home, she found Willie Steen sitting with her mother and sister at the dining-room table. This was the first day that Annie had gone to the office since Wanning's death, and her family awaited her return with suspense. "Hello yourself," Annie called as she came in and threw her handbag into an empty armchair. "You're off early, Annie," said her mother gravely. "Has the will been read?" "I guess so. Yes, I know it has. Miss Wilson got it out of the safe for them. The son came in. He's a pill." "Was nothing said to you, daughter?" "Yes, a lot. Please give me some tea, Mother." Annie felt that her swagger was failing. "Don't tantalize us, Anne," her sister broke in. "Didn't you get anything?" "I got the mitt, all right, and some back talk from the old man that I'm awful sore about." Annie dashed away the tears and gulped her tea. Gradually her mother and Willie drew the story from her. Willie offered at once to go to the office building and take his stand outside the door and never leave it until he had punched old Mr. McQuiston's face. He rose as if to attend to it at once, but Mrs. Willie drew him to his chair again and patted his arm. "It would only start talk and get the girl in trouble, Willie. When it's lawyers, folks in our station is helpless. I certainly believed that man when he sat here. You heard him yourself. Such a gentleman as he looked." Willie thumped his great fist, still in punching position, down on his knee. "Never you be fooled again, Mama Willie. You'll never get anything out of a rich guy that he ain't signed up in the courts for. Rich is tight. There's no exceptions." Annie shook her head. "I didn't want anything out of him. He was a nice, kind man, and he had his troubles, I guess. He wasn't tight." "Still," said Mrs. Woolley sadly, "Mr. Wanning had no call to hold out promises. I hate to be disappointed in a gentleman. You've had confining work for some time, daughter. A rest will do you good." Smart Set, October 1919. End of Part 18. Part 19 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 19. Mark Twain. If there is anything which should make an American sick and disgusted at the literary taste of his country, and almost swerve his allegiance to his flag, it is that controversy between Mark Twain and Max Aurel, in which the Frenchman proves himself a wit and a gentleman, and the American shows himself little short of a clown and an all-around tough. The squabble arose apropos of Paul Bourget's new book on America, Outre-mer, a book which deals more fairly and generously with this country than any book yet written in a foreign tongue. Mr. Clemens did not like the book, and like all men of his class and limited mentality, he cannot criticize without becoming personal and insulting. He cannot be scathing without being a blackguard. He tried to demolish a serious and well-considered work by publishing a scurrilous, slangy, and loosely written article about it. In this article Mr. Clemens proves very little against Mr. Bourget, and a very great deal against himself. He demonstrates clearly that he is neither a scholar, a reader, or a man of letters, and very little of a gentleman. His ignorance of French literature is something appalling. Why, in these days it is as necessary for a literary man to have a wide knowledge of the French masterpieces as it is for him to have read Shakespeare or the Bible. What man who pretends to be an author can afford to neglect those models of style and composition? George Meredith, Thomas Hardy, and Henry James excepted, the great living novelists are Frenchmen. Mr. Clemens asks what the French sensualists can possibly teach the great American people about novel writing or morality. Well, it would not seriously hurt the art of the classic author of Pudd'nhead Wilson to study Daudet, de Maupassant, Hugo, and George Sand, whatever it might do to his morals. Mark Twain is a humorist of a kind. His humor is always rather broad, so broad that the polite world can justly call it coarse. He is not a reader, nor a thinker, nor a man who loves art of any kind. He is a clever Yankee who has made a good thing out of writing. He has been published in the North American Review and in the Century, but he is not and never will be a part of literature. The association and companionship of cultured men has given Mark Twain a sort of professional veneer, but it could not give him fine instincts or nice discriminations or elevated tastes. His works are pure and suitable for children, just as the work of most shallow and mediocre fellows. House dogs and donkeys make the most harmless and chaste companions for young innocents in the world. Mark Twain's humor is of the kind that teamsters use in bantering with each other, and his laugh is the gruff hee-haw of the backwoodsman. He is still the rough, awkward, good-natured boy who swore at the deckhands on the river steamer and chewed uncured tobacco when he was 3 years old. Thoroughly likable as a good fellow, but impossible as a man of letters. It is an unfortunate feature of American literature that a hostler with some natural cleverness and a great deal of assertion receives the same recognition as a standard American author that a man like Lowell does. The French Academy is a good thing after all. It at least divides the sheep from the goats, and gives a sheep the consolation of knowing that he is a sheep. It is rather a pity that Paul Bourget should have written Outre-mer, thoroughly credible book though it is. Mr. Bourget is a novelist, and he should not content himself with being an essayist. There are far too many of them in the world already. He can develop strong characters, invent strong situations, he can write the truth, and he should not drift into penning opinions and platitudes. When God has made a man a creator, it is a great mistake for him to turn critic. It is rather an insult to God, and certainly a very great wrong to man. Nebraska State Journal, May 5, 1895. I got a letter last week from a little boy just 7:30 who had just read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. He said, "If there are any more books like them in the world, send them to me quick." I had to humbly confess to him that if there were any others I had not the good fortune to know of them. What a red-letter day it is to a boy, the day he first opens Tom Sawyer. I would rather sail on the raft down the Missouri again with Huck Finn and Jim than go down the Nile in December or see Venice from a gondola in May. Certainly Mark Twain is much better when he writes of his Missouri boys than when he makes sickly romances about Joan of Arc. And certainly he never did a better piece of work than Prince and Pauper. One seems to get at the very heart of old England in that dearest of children's books, and in its pages the frail boy king and his gloomy sister Mary, who in her day wrought so much woe for unhappy England, and the dashing Princess Elizabeth, who lived to rule so well, seem to live again. A friend of Mr. Clemens once told me that he said he wrote that book so that when his little daughters grew up they might know that their tired old jester of a father could be serious and gentle sometimes. The Home Monthly, May, 1897. End of Part 19. Part 20 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 20, William Dean Howells. Certainly, now in his old age, Mr. Howells is selecting queer titles for his books. A while ago we had that feeble tale, The Coast of Bohemia, and now we have My Literary Passions. Passions, literary or otherwise, were never Mr. Howells' forte, and surely no man could be further from even the coast of Bohemia. Apropos of my literary passions, which has so long strung out in the Ladies' Home Journal along with those thrilling articles about how Henry Ward Beecher tied his necktie and what kind of coffee Mrs. Hall Caine likes, why did Mr. Howells write it? Doesn't Mr. Howells know that at one time or another everyone raves over Don Quixote, imitates Heine, worships Turgenev, and calls Tolstoy a prophet? Does Mr. Howells think that no one but he ever had youth and enthusiasm and aspirations? Doesn't he know that the only thing that makes the world worth living in at all is that once, when we are young, we all have that great love for books and impersonal things, all reverence and dream? We have all known the time when Porthos, Athos, and D'Artagnan were vastly more real and important to us than the folks who lived next door. We have all dwelt in that country where Anna Karenina and the Levins were the only people who mattered much. We have all known that intoxicating period when we thought we understood life, because we had read Daudet, Zola, and Guy de Maupassant, and like Mr. Howells we all looked back rather fondly upon the time when we believed that books were the truth and art was all. After a while, books grow matter-of-fact, like everything else, and we always think enviously of the days when they were new and wonderful and strange. That's a part of existence. We lose our first keen relish for literature just as we lose it for ice cream and confectionery. The taste grows older, wiser, and more subdued. We would all wear out of very enthusiasm if it did not. But why should Mr. Howells tell the world this common experience in detail as though it were his and his alone? He might as well write a detailed account of how he had the measles and the whooping cough. It was all right and proper for Mr. Howells to like Heine and Hugo, but in the words of the circus clown, we've all been there. Nebraska State Journal, July 14, 1895. End of Part 20. Part 21 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 21, Edgar Allan Poe. My tantalized spirit here blandly reposes, forgetting or never regretting its roses, its old agitations of myrtles and roses. For now, while so quietly lying, it fancies a holier odor about it, of pansies, a rosemary odor commingled with pansies, with rue and the beautiful Puritan pansies. Edgar Allan Poe. The Shakespeare Society of New York, which is really about the only useful literary organization in this country, is making vigorous efforts to redress an old wrong and atone for a long neglect. Sunday, September 22nd, it held a meeting at the Poe Cottage on Kingsbridge Road near Fordham for the purpose of starting an organized movement to buy back the cottage, restore it to its original condition, and preserve it as a memorial of Poe. So it has come at last. After helping build monuments to Shelley, Keats, and Carlyle, we have at last remembered this man, the greatest of our poets, and the most unhappy. I am glad that this movement is in the hands of American actors, for it was among them that Poe found his best friends and warmest admirers. Some way, he always seemed to belong to the strolling Thespians who were his mother's people. Among all the thousands of life's little ironies that make history so diverting, there is none more paradoxical than that Edgar Poe should have been an American. Look at his face. Had we ever another like it? He must have been a strange figure in his youth, among those genial, courtly Virginians, this handsome, pale fellow, violent in his enthusiasm, ardent in his worship, but spiritually cold in his affections. now playing heavily for the mere excitement of play, now worshipping at the shrine of a woman old enough to be his mother, merely because her voice was beautiful, now swimming 6 miles up the James River against a heavy current in the glaring sun of a June midday. He must have seemed to them an unreal figure, a sort of stage man who was wandering about the streets with his mask and buskins on, a theatrical figure who had escaped by some strange mischance into the prosaic daylight. His speech and actions were unconsciously and sincerely dramatic, always as though done for effect. He had that nervous, egotistic, self-centered nature common to stage children who seem to have been dazzled by the footlights and maddened by the applause before they are born. It was in his blood. With the exception of 2 women who loved him, lived for him, died for him, he went through life friendless, misunderstood, with that dense, complete, hopeless misunderstanding which, as Amiel said, is the secret of that sad smile upon the lips of the great. Men tried to befriend him, but in some way or other he hurt and disappointed them. He tried to mingle and share with other men, but he was always shut from them by that shadow, light as gossamer but unyielding as adamant, by which from the beginning of the world art has shielded and guarded and protected her own, that God-concealing mist in which the heroes of old were hidden, immersed in that gloom and solitude which, if we could but know it here, is but the shadow of God's hand as it falls upon his elect. We lament our dearth of great prose. With the exception of Henry James and Hawthorne, Poe is our only master of pure prose. We lament our dearth of poets. With the exception of Lowell, Poe is our only great poet. Poe found short story writing a bungling makeshift. He left it a perfect art. He wrote the first perfect short stories in the English language. He first gave the short story purpose, method, and artistic form. In a careless reading one cannot realize the wonderful literary art, the cunning devices, the masterly effects that those entrancing tales conceal. They are simple and direct enough to delight us when we are children, subtle and artistic enough to be our marvel when we are old. To this day they are the wonder and admiration of the French, who are the acknowledged masters of craft and form. How in his wandering, laborious life, bound to the hack work of the press, and crushed by an ever-growing burden of want and debt, did he ever come upon all this deep and mystical lore, this knowledge of all history, of all languages, of all art, this penetration into the hidden things of the East? As Stedman says, the self-training of genius is always a marvel. The past is spread before us all, and most of us spend our lives in learning those things which we do not need to know, but genius reaches out instinctively and takes only the vital detail, by some sort of spiritual gravitation, goes directly to the right thing. Poe belonged to the modern French school of decorative and discriminating prose before it ever existed in France. He rivaled Gautier, Flaubert, and de Maupassant before they were born. He clothed his tales in a barbaric splendor and persuasive unreality never before heard of in English. No such profusion of color, oriental splendor of detail, grotesque combinations, and mystical effects had ever before been wrought into language. There are tales as grotesque, as monstrous, unearthly as the stone griffins and gargoyles that are cut up among the unvisited niches and towers of Notre Dame. Stories as poetic and delicately beautiful as the golden lace-work chased upon an Etruscan ring. He fitted his words together as the Byzantine jewelers fitted priceless stones. He found the inner harmony and kinship of words. Where lived another man who could blend the beautiful and the horrible, the gorgeous and the grotesque in such intricate and inexplicable fashion? Who could delight you with his noun and disgust you with his verb, thrill you with his adjective, and chill you with his adverb, make you run the whole gamut of human emotions in a single sentence. Sitting in that miserable cottage at Fordham, he wrote of the splendor of dream palaces beyond the dreams of art. He hung those grimy walls with dream tapestries, paved those narrow halls with black marble and polished onyx, and into those low-roofed chambers he brought all the treasured imagery of fancy, from the huge carvings of untutored Egypt to mingled and conflicting perfumes reeking up from strange convolute censers, together with multitudinous flaring and flickering tongues of purple and violet fire. Hungry and ragged, he wrote of Epicurean feasts and luxury that would have beggared the purpled pomp of pagan Rome and put Nero and his golden house to shame. And this mighty master of the organ of language, who knew its every stop and pipe, who could awaken at will the thin silver tones of its slenderest reeds or the solemn cadence of its deepest thunder, who could make it sing like a flute or roar like a cataract. He was born into a country without a literature. He was of that ornate school which usually comes last in a national literature, and he came first. American taste had been vitiated by men like Griswold and N. P. Willis until it was at the lowest possible ebb. Willis was considered a genius. That is the worst that could possibly be said. In the North a new race of great philosophers was growing up, but Poe had neither their friendship nor encouragement. He went, indeed, sometimes to the chilly salon of Margaret Fuller, but he was always a discord there. He was a mere artist, and he had no business with philosophy. He had no theories as to the higher life and the true happiness. He had only his unshapen dreams that battled with him in dark places, the unborn that struggled in his brain for birth. What time has an artist to learn the multiplication table or to talk philosophy? He was not afraid of them. He laughed at Willis and flung Longfellow's lie in his teeth, the lie the rest of the world was 20 years in finding. He scorned the obtrusive learning of the transcendentalists, and he disliked their hard, talkative women. He left them and went back to his dream women, his Berenice, his Ligeia, his Marchesa Aphrodite, pale and cold as the mist maidens of the north, sad as the Norns who weep for human woe. The tragedy of Poe's life was not alcohol, but hunger. He died when he was 40, when his work was just beginning. Thackeray had not touched his great novels at 40. George Eliot was almost unknown at that age. Hugo, Goethe, Hawthorne, Lowell, and Dumas all did their great work after they were 40 years old. Poe never did his great work. He could not endure the hunger. This year the Drexel Institute has put over $60,000 into a new edition of Poe's poems and stories. He himself never got $6,000 for them altogether. If one of the great and learned institutions of the land had invested 1/10 of that amount in the living author 40 years ago, we should have had from him such works as would have made the name of this nation great. But he sold The Masque of the Red Death for a few dollars, and now the Drexel Institute pays a publisher thousands to publish it beautifully. It is enough to make Satan laugh until his ribs ache, and all the little devils laugh and heap on fresh coals. I don't wonder they hate humanity. It's so dense, so hopelessly stupid. Only a few weeks before Poe's death, he said he had never had time or opportunity to make a serious effort. All his tales were merely experiments, thrown off when his day's work as a journalist was over, when he should have been asleep. All those voyages into the mystical unknown, into the gleaming, impalpable kingdom of pure romance from which he brought back such splendid trophies, were but experiments. He was only getting his tools into shape, getting ready for his great effort, the effort that never came. Bread seems a little thing to stand in the way of genius, but it can. The simple, sordid facts were these, that in the bitterest storms of winter Poe seldom wrote by a fire, that after he was 25 years old he never knew what it was to have enough to eat without dreading tomorrow's hunger. Chatterton had only himself to sacrifice, but Poe saw the woman he loved die of want before his very eyes, die smiling and begging him not to give up his work. They saw the depths together in those long winter nights when she lay in that cold room, wrapped in Poe's only coat, he with one hand holding hers and with the other dashing off some of the most perfect masterpieces of English prose. And when he would wince and turn white at her coughing, she would always whisper, "Work on, my poet, and when you have finished, read it to me. I am happy when I listen." Oh, the devotion of women and the madness of art! They are the two most awesome things on earth, and surely this man knew both to the full. I have wondered so often how he did it, how he kept his purpose always clean and his taste always perfect. How it was that hard labor never wearied nor jaded him, never limited his imagination, that the jarring clamor about him never drowned the fine harmonies of his fancy. His discrimination remained always delicate, and from the constant strain of toil his fancy always rose strong and unfettered. Without encouragement or appreciation of any sort, without models or precedents, he built up that pure style of his that is without peer in the language, that style of which every sentence is a drawing by Fetter. Elizabeth Barrett and a few great artists over in France knew what he was doing. They knew that in literature he was making possible a new heaven and a new earth. But he never knew that they knew it. He died without the assurance that he was, or ever would be, understood. And yet, through all this, with the whole world of art and letters against him, betrayed by his own people, he managed to keep that lofty ideal of perfect work. What he suffered never touched or marred his work, but it wrecked his character. Poe's character was made by his necessity. He was a liar and an egotist. A man who had to beg for bread at the hands of his publishers and critics could be nothing but a liar, and had he not had the insane egotism and conviction of genius, he would have broken down and written the drivelling trash that his countrymen delighted to read. Poe lied to his publishers sometimes, there is no doubt of that, but there were two to whom he was never false, his wife and his muse. He drank sometimes, too, when for very ugly and relentless reasons he could not eat. And then he forgot what he suffered. For Bacchus is the kindest of the gods, after all. When Aphrodite has fooled us and left us, and Athene has betrayed us in battle, then poor tipsy Bacchus, who covers his head with vine leaves where the curls are getting thin, holds out his cup to us and says, "Forget." It's poor consolation, but he means it well. The Transcendentalists were good conversationalists. That, in fact, was their principal accomplishment. They used to talk a great deal of genius, that rare and capricious spirit that visits earth so seldom, that is wooed by so many and won by so few. They had grand theories that all men should be poets, that the visits of that rare spirit should be made as frequent and universal as afternoon calls. Oh, they had plans to make a whole generation of little geniuses. But she only laughed her scornful laughter, that deathless lady of the immortals, up in her echoing chambers that are floored with dawn and roofed with the spangled stars. And she snatched from them the only man of their nation she had ever deigned to love, whose lips she had touched with music and whose soul with song. In his youth she had shown him the secrets of her beauty, and his manhood had been one pursuit of her, blind to all else, like Anchises, who on the night that he knew the love of Venus was struck sightless, that he might never behold the face of a mortal woman. For Our Lady of Genius has no care for the prayers and groans of mortals, nor for their hecatombs sweet of savour. Many a time of old she has foiled the plans of seers, and none may entreat her or take her by force. She favours no one nation or clime, she takes one from the millions, and when she gives herself unto a man, it is without his will or that of his fellows, and he pays for it. Dear Heaven, he pays. The sun comes forth, and many reptiles spawn. He sets, and each ephemeral insect then is gathered unto death without a dawn, and the immortal stars awake again. Yes, the immortal stars awake again. None may thwart the unerring justice of the gods, not even the transcendentalists. What matter that one man's life was miserable, that one man was broken on the wheel? His work lives, and his crown is eternal. That the work of his age was undone, that is the pity. That the work of his youth was done, that is the glory. The man is nothing. There are millions of men. The work is everything. There is so little perfection. We lament our dearth of poets when we let Poe starve. We are like the Hebrews who stoned their prophets, and then marveled that the voice of God was silent. We will wait a long time for another. There are Griswold and N.P. Willis, our chosen ones. Let us turn to them. Their names are forgotten. God is just. They are gathered unto death without a dawn, and the immortal stars awake again. The Courier, October 12, 1895. You can afford to give a little more care and attention to this imaginative boy of yours than to any of your other children. His nerves are more finely strung, and all his life he will need your love more than the others. Be careful to get him the books he likes, and see that they are good ones. Get him a volume of Poe's short stories. I know that many people are prejudiced against Poe because of the story that he drank himself to death. But that myth has been exploded long ago. Poe drank less than even the average man of his time. No, the most artistic of all American storytellers did not die because he drank too much, but because he ate too little. And yet we, his own countrymen, who should be so proud of him, are not content with having starved him and wronged him while he lived. We must even go on slandering him after he has been dead almost 50 years. But get his works for this imaginative boy of yours, and he will tell you how great a man the author of The Gold Bug and The Masque of the Red Death was. Children are impartial critics, and sometimes very good ones. They do not reason about a book, they just like it or dislike it intensely. And after all, that is the conclusion of the whole matter. I am very sure that The Fall of the House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Black Cat will give this wool-gathering lad of yours more pleasure than a new bicycle could. The Home Monthly, May, 1897. End of Part 21. Part 22 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 22, Walt Whitman. Speaking of monuments reminds one that there is more talk about a monument to Walt Whitman, the good gray poet. Just why the adjective good is always applied to Whitman it is difficult to discover, probably because people who could not understand him at all took it for granted that he meant well. If ever there was a poet who had no literary ethics at all beyond those of nature, it was he. He was neither good nor bad, any more than are the animals he continually admired and envied. He was a poet without an exclusive sense of the poetic, a man without the finer discriminations, enjoying everything with the unreasoning enthusiasm of a boy. He was the poet of the dunghill as well as of the mountains, which is admirable in theory but excruciating in verse. In the same paragraph he informs you that the pure contralto sings in the organ loft, and that the malformed limbs are tied to the table, what is removed dropped horribly into a pail. No branch of surgery is poetic, and that hopelessly prosaic word pail would kill a whole volume of sonnets. Whitman's poems are reckless rhapsodies over creation in general, sometimes sublime, sometimes ridiculous. He declares that the ocean, with its imperious waves commanding, is beautiful, and that the fly specks on the walls are also beautiful. Such catholic taste may go in science, but in poetry their results are sad. The poet's task is usually to select the poetic. Whitman never bothers to do that. He takes everything in the universe, from fly specks to the fixed stars. His Leaves of Grass is a sort of dictionary of the English language, and in it is the name of everything in creation set down with great reverence, but without any particular connection. But however ridiculous Whitman may be, there is a primitive elemental force about him. He is so full of hardiness and the joy of life. He looks at all nature in the delighted, admiring way in which the old Greeks and the primitive poets did. He exults so in the red blood in his body and the strength in his arms. He has such a passion for the warmth and dignity of all that is natural. He has no code but to be natural, a code that this complex world has so long outgrown. He is sensual, not after the manner of Swinburne and Gautier, who are always seeking for perverted and bizarre effects on the senses, but in the frank fashion of the old barbarians, who ate and slept and married and smacked their lips over the mead horn. He is rigidly limited to the physical, things that quicken his pulses, please his eyes, or delight his nostrils. There is an element of poetry in all this, but it is by no means the highest. If a joyous elephant should break forth into song, his lay would probably be very much like Whitman's famous Song of Myself. It would have just about as much delicacy and deftness and discrimination. He says, "I think I could turn and live with the animals. They are so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. Not one is dissatisfied, nor not one is demented with the mania of many things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. Not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth." And that is not irony on nature. He means just that. Life meant no more to him. He accepted the world just as it is, and glorified it, the seemly and unseemly, the good and the bad. He had no conception of a difference in people or in things. All men had bodies and were alike to him, one about as good as another. To live was to fulfill all natural laws and impulses. To be comfortable was to be happy. To be happy was the ultimatum. He did not realize the existence of a conscience or a responsibility. He had no more thought of good or evil than the folks in Kipling's Jungle Book. And yet there is an undeniable charm about this optimistic vagabond who is made so happy by the warm sunshine and the smell of spring fields, a sort of good fellowship and wholeheartedness in every line he wrote. His veneration for things physical and material, for all that is in water or air or land, is so real that as you read him, you think for the moment that you would rather like to live so, if you could. For the time you half believed that a sound body and a strong arm are the greatest things in the world. Perhaps no book shows so much as Leaves of Grass that keen senses do not make a poet. When you read it, you realize how spirited a thing poetry really is, and how great a part spiritual perceptions play in apparently sensuous verse, if only to select the beautiful from the gross. Nebraska State Journal, January 19, 1896. End of Part 22. Part 23 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 23. Henry James. Their mania for careless and hasty work is not confined to the lesser men. Howells and Hardy have gone with the crowd. Now that Stevenson is dead, I can think of but one English-speaking author who is really keeping his self-respect and sticking for perfection. Of course, I refer to that mighty master of language and keen student of human actions and motives, Henry James. In the last 4 years he has published, I believe, just 2 small volumes, The Lesson of the Master and Terminations. And in those 2 little volumes of short stories, he who will may find out something of what it means to be really an artist. The framework is perfect and the polish is absolutely without flaw. They are sometimes a little hard, always calculating and dispassionate, but they are perfect. I wish James would write about modern society, about degeneracy and the new woman and all the rest of it. Not that he would throw any light on it, he seldom does, but he would say such awfully clever things about it and turn on so many sidelights. And then his sentences! If his character novels were all wrong, one could read them forever for the mere beauty of his sentences. He never lets his phrases run away with him. They are never dull and never too brilliant. He subjects them to the general tone of his sentence, and has his whole paragraph partake of the same predominating color. You are never startled, never surprised, never thrilled, or never enraptured. Always delighted by that masterly prose that is as correct as classical, as calm and as subtle as the music of Mozart. The Courier, November 16, 1895. It is strange that from Felicia down the stage novel has never been a success. Henry James' Tragic Muse is the only theatrical novel that has a particle of the real spirit of the stage in it, a glimpse of the enthusiasm, the devotion, the exaltation and the sordid, the frivolous and the vulgar, which are so strangely and inextricably blended in that life of the green room. For although Henry James cannot write plays, he can write passing well of the people who enact them. He has put into one book all those inevitable attendants of the drama, the patronizing theatre-goer who loves it above all things, and yet feels so far superior to it personally; the old tragedienne, the queen of a dying school, whose word is law and whose judgments are to a young actor as the judgments of God. And of course there is the girl, the aspirant, the tragic muse, who beats and beats upon those brazen doors that guard the unapproachable, until one fine morning she beats them down and comes into her kingdom, the kingdom of unborn beauty that is to live through her. It is a great novel, that book of the masters, so perfect as a novel that one does not realize what a masterly study it is of the life and ends and aims of the people who make plays live. Nebraska State Journal, March 29, 1896. End of Part 23. Part 24 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 24. Harold Frederic. The Marketplace. Harold Frederic, $1.50, New York, F. A. Stokes & Company, Pittsburgh, J. R. Weldon & Company. Unusual interest is attached to the posthumous work of that great man whose career ended so prematurely and so tragically. The story is a study in the ethics and purposes of money-getting, in the romantic element in modern business. In it, finance is presented not as being merely the province of shrewdness or greediness or petty personal gratification, but of great projects, of great brain battles, a field for the exercising of talent, daring, imagination, appealing to the strength of a strong man, filling the same place in men's lives that was once filled by the incentives of war, kindling in man the desire for the leadership of men. The hero of the story, Joel Thorpe, is one of those men, huge of body, keen of brain, with cast-iron nerves, as sound a heart as most men, and a magnificent capacity for bluff. He has lived and risked and lost in a dozen countries, been almost within reach of fortune a dozen times, and always missed her until finally, in London, by promoting a great rubber syndicate, he becomes a multimillionaire. He marries the most beautiful and one of the most impecunious peeresses in England, and retires to his country estate. There, as a gentleman of leisure, he loses his motive in life, loses power for lack of opportunity, and grows less commanding even in the eyes of his wife, who misses the uncompromising barbaric strength which took her by storm and won her. Finally, he evolves a gigantic philanthropic scheme of spending his money as laboriously as he made it. Mr. Frederic says, Napoleon was the greatest man of his age, one of the greatest men of all ages, not only in war, but in 100 other ways. He spent the last 6 years of his life at St. Helena in excellent health, with companions that he talked freely to, and in all the extraordinarily copious reports of his conversations there, we don't get a single sentence worth repeating. The greatness had entirely evaporated from him the moment he was put on an island where he had nothing to do. It is very fitting that Mr. Frederic's last book should be in praise of action, the thing that makes the world go round; of force, however misspent, which is the sum of life as distinguished from the inertia of death. In the 40-odd years of his life he wrote almost as many pages as Balzac, most of it mere newspaper copy, it is true, read and forgotten, but all of it vigorous and with the stamp of a strong man upon it. And he played just as hard as he worked. Alas, it was the play that killed him. The young artist who illustrated the story gave to the pictures of Joel Thorpe very much the look of Harold Frederic himself, and they might almost stand for his portraits. I fancy the young man did not select his model carelessly. In this big, burly adventurer who took fortune and women by storm, who bluffed the world by his prowess and fought his way to the front with battle-axe blows, there is a great deal of Harold Frederic, the soldier of fortune, the Utica milk boy who fought his way from the petty slavery of a provincial newspaper to the foremost ranks of the journalists of the world, and on into literature worth the writing. The man won his place in England much as his hero won his, by defiance, by strong shoulder blows, by his self-sufficiency and inexhaustible strength, and when he finished his book he did not know that his end would be so much less glorious than his hero's, that it would be his portion not to fall manfully in the thick of the combat and the press of battle, but to die poisoned in the tent of crisis. For who could foresee a tragedy so needless, so blind, so brutal in its lack of dignity, or know that such strength could perish through such insidious weakness, that so great a man could be stung to death by a mania born in little minds? In point of execution and literary excellence, both The Market-Place and Gloria Mundi are vastly inferior to The Damnation of Theron Ware, or that exquisite London idyll, March Hares. The first 200 pages of Theron Ware are as good as anything in American fiction, much better than most of it. They are not so much the work of a literary artist as of a vigorous thinker, a man of strong opinions and an intimate and comprehensive knowledge of men. The whole work, despite its irregularities and indifference to form, is full of brain stuff, the kind of active, healthful, masterful intellect that some men put into politics, some into science, and a few, very few, into literature. Both Gloria Mundi and The Market-Place bear unmistakable evidences of the slack rein and the hasty hand. Both of them contain considerable padding, the stamp of the space writer. They are imperfectly developed and are not packed with ideas like his earlier novels. Their excellence is in flashes. It is not the searching, evenly distributed light which permeates his more careful work. There were, as we know too well, good reasons why Mr. Frederic should work hastily. He needed a large income, and he worked heroically, writing many thousands of words a day to obtain it. From the experience of the ages we have learned to expect to find, coupled with great strength, a proportionate weakness, and usually it devours the greater part, as the 7 lean kine devoured the 7 fat in Pharaoh's vision. Achilles was a god in all his nobler parts, but his feet were of the earth, and to the earth they held him down, and he died stung by an arrow in the heel. Pittsburgh Leader, June 10, 1899. End of Part 24. Part 25 of A Collection of Stories, Reviews, and Essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 25, Kate Chopin. The Awakening. Kate Chopin, $1.25, Chicago, H.S. Stone & Company, Pittsburgh, J.R. Weldon & Company. A Creole Bovary is this little novel of Miss Chopin's. Not that the heroine is a Creole exactly, or that Miss Chopin is a Flaubert, save the mark, but the theme is similar to that which occupied Flaubert. There was indeed no need that a second Madame Bovary should be written, but an author's choice of themes is frequently as inexplicable as his choice of a wife. It is governed by some innate temperamental bias that cannot be diagrammed. This is particularly so in women who write, and I shall not attempt to say why Miss Chopin has devoted so exquisite and sensitive, well-governed a style to so trite and sordid a theme. She writes much better than it is ever given to most people to write, and hers is a genuinely literary style. Of no great elegance or solidity, but light, flexible, subtle, and capable of producing telling effects directly and simply. The story she has to tell in the present instance is new neither in matter nor treatment. Edna Pontellier, a Kentucky girl, who, like Emma Bovary, had been in love with innumerable dream heroes before she was out of short skirts, married Léonce Pontellier as a sort of reaction from a vague and visionary passion for a tragedian whose unresponsive picture she used to kiss. She acquired the habit of liking her husband in time, and even of liking her children. Though we are not justified in presuming that she ever threw articles from her dressing-table at them, as the charming Emma had a winsome habit of doing, we are told that she would sometimes gather them passionately to her heart, she would sometimes forget them. At a Creole watering place, which is admirably and deftly sketched by Miss Chopin, Edna met Robert Lebrun, son of the landlady, who dreamed of a fortune awaiting him in Mexico, while he occupied a petty clerical position in New Orleans. Robert made it his business to be agreeable to his mother's boarders, and Edna, not being a Creole, much against his wish and will, took him seriously. Robert went to Mexico, but found that fortunes were no easier to make there than in New Orleans. He returns and does not even call to pay his respects to her. She encounters him at the home of a friend, and takes him home with her. She wheedles him into staying for dinner, and we are told she sent the maid off in search of some delicacy she had not thought of for herself, and she recommended great care in the dripping of the coffee and having the omelette done to a turn. Only a few pages back we were informed that the husband, M. Pontellier, had cold soup and burnt fish for his supper. Such is life. The lover, of course, disappointed her, was a coward, and ran away from his responsibilities before they began. He was afraid to begin a chapter with so serious and limited a woman. She remembered the sea where she had first met Robert. Perhaps from the same motive which threw Anna Karenina under the engine wheels, she threw herself into the sea, swam until she was tired, and then let go. She looked into the distance, and for a moment the old terror flamed up, then sank again. She heard her father's voice and her sister Margaret's. She heard the barking of an old dog that was chained to the sycamore tree. The spurs of the cavalry officer clanged as he walked across the porch. There was a hum of bees, and the musky odor of pinks filled the air. Edna Pontellier and Emma Bovary are studies in the same feminine type. One a finished and complete portrayal, the other a hasty sketch, but the theme is essentially the same. Both women belong to a class, not large, but forever clamoring in our ears, that demands more romance out of life than God put into it. Mr. G. Bernard Shaw would say that they are the victims of the over-idealization of love. They are the spoil of the poets, the Iphigenias of sentiment. The unfortunate feature of their disease is that it attacks only women of brains, at least of rudimentary brains, but whose development is one-sided, women of strong and fine intuitions, but without the faculty of observation, comparison, reasoning about things. Probably for emotional people, the most convenient thing about being able to think is that it occasionally gives them a rest from feeling. Now, with women of the Bovary type, this relaxation and recreation is impossible. They are not critics of life, but in the most personal sense partakers of life. They receive impressions through the fancy. With them everything begins with fancy, and passions rise in the brain rather than in the blood, the poor, neglected, limited, one-sided brain that might do so much better things than badgering itself into frantic endeavors to love. For these are the people who pay with their blood for the fine ideals of the poets, as Marie de Classe paid for Dumas' great creation, Marguerite Gautier. These people really expect the passion of love to fill and gratify every need of life, whereas nature only intended that it should meet one of many demands. They insist upon making it stand for all the emotional pleasures of life and art, expecting an individual and self-limited passion to yield infinite variety, pleasure, and distraction, to contribute to their lives what the arts and the pleasurable exercise of the intellect gives to less limited and less intense idealists. So this passion, when set up against Shakespeare, Balzac, Wagner, Raphael, fails them. They have staked everything on one hand, and they lose. They have driven the blood until it will drive no further. They have played their nerves up to the point where any relaxation, short of absolute annihilation, is impossible. Every idealist abuses his nerves, and every sentimentalist brutally abuses them. And in the end the nerves get even. Nobody ever cheats them, really. Then the awakening comes. Sometimes it comes in the form of arsenic, as it came to Emma Bovary. Sometimes it is carbolic acid taken covertly in the police station, a goal to which unbalanced idealism not infrequently leads. Edna Pontellier, fanciful and romantic to the last, chose the sea on a summer night, and went down with the sound of her first lover's spurs in her ears, and the scent of pinks about her. And next time, I hope that Miss Chopin will devote that flexible, iridescent style of hers to a better cause. Pittsburgh Leader, July 8, 1899. End of Part 25. Part 26 of A Collection of Stories, Reviews, and Essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 26, Stephen Crane. War is Kind, Stephen Crane, $2.50, New York, F.A. Stokes and Company, Pittsburgh, J.R. Weldon and Company. This truly remarkable book is printed on dirty gray blotting paper, on each page of which is a mere dot of print over a large I of vacancy. There are seldom more than 10 lines on a page, and it would be better if most of those lines were not there at all. Either Mr. Crane is insulting the public or insulting himself, or he has developed a case of atavism and is chattering the primeval nonsense of the apes. His Black Riders, uneven as it was a casket of polished masterpieces when compared with War is Kind, and it is not kind at all, Mr. Crane. When it provokes such verses as these, it is all that Sherman said it was. The only production in the volume that is at all coherent is the following, from which the book gets its title. Do not weep, maiden, for war is kind, because your lover threw wild hands toward the sky, and the affrighted steed ran on alone. Do not weep, war is kind. Hoarse booming drums of the regiment, little souls who thirst for fight, these men were born to drill and die. The unexplained glory flies above them. Great is the battle god, great and his kingdom a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Do not weep, babe, for war is kind, because your father tumbled in the yellow trenches, raged at the breast, gulped and died. Do not weep, war is kind. Swift blazing flag of the regiment, eagle with crest of red and gold, these men were born to drill and die. Point for them the virtue of slaughter, make plain to them the excellence of killing, and a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Mother, whose heart hung humble as a button on the bright, splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, war is kind. Of course, one may have objections to hearts hanging like humble buttons, or to buttons being humble at all, but one should not stop to quarrel about such trifles with a poet who can perpetrate the following. Thou art my love, and thou art the beard on another man's face. Woe is me! Thou art my love, and thou art a temple, and in this temple is an altar, and on this temple is my heart. Woe is me! Thou art my love, and thou art a wretch. Let these sacred love lies choke thee, for I am come to where I know your lies as truth, and your truth as lies. Woe is me! Now, if you please, is the object of these verses animal, mineral, or vegetable? Is the expression, thou art the beard on another man's face, intended as a figure, or was it written by a barber? Certainly, after reading this, Simple Simon is a ballade of perfect form, and Jack and Jill, or Hickety-Pickety, my black hen, are exquisite lyrics. But of the following what shall be said? Now let me crunch you with full weight of affrighted love. I doubted you, and in this short doubting my love grew like a genie for my further undoing. Beware of my friends, be not in speech too civil, for in all courtesy my weak heart sees spectres, mists of desire, arising from the lips of my chosen. Be not civil. This is somewhat more lucid as evincing the bard's exquisite sensitiveness. Ah, God, the way your little finger moved as you thrust a bare arm backward, and made play with your hair and a comb, a silly gilt comb. Ah, God, that I should suffer because of the way a little finger moved. Mr. Crane's verselets are illustrated by some Bradley pictures which are badly drawn, in bad taste, and come with bad grace. On page 33 of the book there are just 2 lines which seem to completely sum up the efforts of both poet and artist. "My good friend," said a learned bystander, "your operations are mad." Yet this fellow Crane has written short stories equal to some of Maupassant's. Pittsburgh Leader, June 3, 1899. After reading such a delightful newspaper story as Mr. Frank Norris's Blix, it is with assorted sensations of pain and discomfort that one closes the covers of another newspaper novel, Active Service by Stephen Crane. If one happens to have some trifling regard for pure English, he does not come forth from the reading of this novel unscathed. The hero of this lurid tale is a newspaper man, and he edits the Sunday edition of the New York Eclipse, and delights in publishing stories about deformed and sightless infants. The office of the Eclipse was at the top of an immense building on Broadway. It was a sheer mountain, to the heights of which the interminable thunder of the streets rose faintly. The Hudson was a broad path of silver in the distance. This leaves little doubt as to the fortunate journal which had secured Rufus Coleman as its Sunday editor. Mr. Coleman's days were spent in collecting yellow sensations for his paper, and we are told that he planned for each edition as for a campaign. The following elevating passage is one of the realistic paragraphs by which Mr. Crane makes the routine of Coleman's life known to us. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and a cage of bronze, gilt and steel dropped magically from above. Coleman yelled, "Down!" A door flew open. Coleman stepped upon the elevator. "Well, Johnny," he said cheerfully to the lad who operated the machine, "is business good?" "Yes, sir, pretty good," answered the boy, grinning. The little cage sank swiftly. Floor after floor seemed to be rising with marvelous speed. The whole building was winging straight into the sky. There was soaring lights, figures, and the opalescent glow of ground-glass doors marked with black inscriptions. Other lights were springing heavenward. All the lofty corridors rang with cries, "Up! Down! Down! Up!" The boy's hand grasps a lever, and his machine obeyed his lightest movement with sometimes an unbalancing swiftness. Later, when Coleman reaches the street, Mr. Crane describes the cable cars as marching like panoplied elephants, which is rather far, to say the least. The gentleman's nights were spent something as follows. In the restaurant he first ordered a large bottle of champagne. The last of the wine he finished in sombre mood, like an unbroken and defiant man who chews the straw that litters his prison-house. During his dinner he was continually sending out messenger boys. He was arranging a poker party. Through a window he watched the beautiful moving life of Upper Broadway at night, with its crowds and clanging cable cars, and its electric signs, mammoth and glittering like the jewels of a giantess. Word was brought to him that poker players were arriving. He arose joyfully, leaving his cheese. In the broad hall, occupied mainly by miscellaneous people and actors, all deep in leather chairs, he found some of his friends waiting. They trooped upstairs to Coleman's room, where, as a preliminary, Coleman began to hurl books and papers from the table to the floor. A boy came with drinks. Most of the men, in order to prepare for the game, removed their coats and cuffs, and drew up the sleeves of their shirts. The electric globes shed a blinding light upon the table. The sound of clinking chips arose. The elected banker spun the cards, careless and dexterous. The atmosphere of the entire novel is just that close and enervating. Every page is like the next morning taste of a champagne supper, and is heavy with the smell of stale cigarettes. There is no fresh air in the book, and no sunlight, only the blinding light shed by the electric globes. If the life of New York newspaper men is as unwholesome and sordid as this, Mr. Crane, who has experienced it, ought to be sadly ashamed to tell it. Next morning, when Coleman went for breakfast in the grill-room of his hotel, he ordered eggs on toast and a pint of champagne for breakfast, and discoursed affably to the waiter. "Maybe you had a pretty lively time last night, Mr. Coleman?" "Yes, Pat," answered Coleman, "I did. It was all because of an unrequited affection, Patrick." The man stood near, a napkin over his arm. Coleman went on impressively, "The ways of the modern lover are strange. Now I, Patrick, am a modern lover, and when yesterday the dagger of disappointment was driven deep into my heart, I immediately played poker as hard as I could, and incidentally got loaded. This is the modern point of view. I understand on good authority that in old times lovers used to languish. That is probably a lie, but at any rate we do not, in these times, languish to any great extent. We get drunk. Do you understand, Patrick?" The waiter was used to harangue at Coleman's breakfast time. He placed his hand over his mouth and giggled. "Yes, sir." "Of course," continued Coleman thoughtfully, "it might be pointed out by uneducated persons that it is difficult to maintain a high standard of drunkenness for the adequate length of time, but in the series of experiments which I am about to make, I am sure I can easily prove them to be in the wrong." "I am sure, sir," said the waiter, "the young ladies would not like to be hearing you talk this way." "Yes, no doubt, no doubt. The young ladies have still quite medieval ideas. They don't understand. They still prefer lovers to languish." "At any rate, sir, I don't see that your heart is sure enough broken. You seem to take it very easy." "Broken!" cried Coleman. "Easy! Man, my heart is in fragments. Bring me another small bottle." After this, Coleman went to Greece to write up the war for the eclipse, and incidentally to rescue his sweetheart from the hands of the Turks and make copy of it. Very valid arguments might be advanced that the lady would have fared better with the Turks. On the voyage, Coleman spent all his days and nights in the card room, and avoided the deck, since fresh air was naturally disagreeable to him. For all that he saw of Greece, or that Mr. Crane's readers see of Greece, Coleman might as well have stayed in the card room of the steamer, or in the card room of his New York hotel, for that matter. Wherever he goes he carries the atmosphere of the card room with him, and the blinding glare of the electrics. In Greece he makes love when he has leisure, but he makes copy much more ardently, and on the whole is quite as lurid and sordid and showy as his worst Sunday editions. Some good bits of battle description there are, of the Red Badge of Courage order, but one cannot make a novel of clever descriptions of earthworks and poker games. The book concerns itself not with large universal interests or principles, but with a yellow journalist, grinding out yellow copy in such a wooden fashion that the Sunday eclipse must have been even worse than most. In spite of the fact that Mr. Crane has written some of the most artistic short stories in the English language, I begin to wonder whether, blinded by his youth and audacity, two qualities which the American people love, we have not taken him too seriously. It is a grave matter for a man in good health and with a bank account to have written a book so coarse and dull and charmless as Active Service. Compared with this, War Was Kind indeed. Pittsburgh Leader, November 11, 1899. End of Part 26. Part 27 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 27, Frank Norris. A new and great book has been written. The name of it is McTeague, A Story of San Francisco, and the man who wrote it is Mr. Frank Norris. The great presses of the country go on year after year grinding out commonplace books, just as each generation goes on busily reproducing its own mediocrity. When in this enormous output of ink and paper, these thousands of volumes that are yearly rushed upon the shelves of the bookstores, one appears which contains both power and promise, the reader may be pardoned some enthusiasm. Excellence always surprises. We are never quite prepared for it. In the case of McTeague, A Story of San Francisco, it is even more surprising than usual. In the first place, the title is not alluring, and not until you have read the book can you know that there is an admirable consistency in the stiff, uncompromising commonplaceness of that title. In the second place, the name of the author is as yet comparatively unfamiliar, and finally, the book is dedicated to a member of the Harvard faculty, suggesting that whether it be a story of San Francisco or Dawson City, it must necessarily be vaporous, introspective, and chiefly concerned with literary impressions. Mr. Norris is indeed a Harvard man, but that he is a good many other kinds of a man is self-evident. His book is, in the language of Mr. Norman Hapgood, the work of a large human being with a firm stomach who knows and loves the people. In a novel of such high merit as this, the subject matter is the least important consideration. Every newspaper contains the essential material for another comédie humaine. In this case, McTeague, the central figure, happens to be a dentist practicing in a little side street of San Francisco. The novel opens with this description of him. It was Sunday, and according to his custom on that day, McTeague took his dinner at 2 in the afternoon at the car conductor's coffee joint on Polk Street. He had a thick gray soup, heavy underdone meat, very hot on a cold plate, 2 kinds of vegetables, and a sort of suet pudding, full of strong butter and sugar. Once in his office, or as he called it on his signboard, dental parlors, he took off his coat and shoes, unbuttoned his vest, and having crammed his little stove with coke, he lay back in his operating chair at the bay window, reading the paper, drinking steam beer, and smoking his huge porcelain pipe while his food digested. Crop full, stupid, and warm. McTeague had grown up in a mining camp in the mountains. He remembered the years he had spent there trundling heavy cars of ore in and out of the tunnel under the direction of his father. For 13 days out of each fortnight his father was a steady, hard-working shift boss of the mine. Every other Sunday he became an irresponsible animal, a beast, a brute, crazed with alcohol. His mother cooked for the miners. Her one ambition was that her son should enter a profession. He was apprenticed to a traveling quack dentist, and after a fashion learned the business. Then one day in San Francisco had come the news of his mother's death. She had left him some money, not much, but enough to set him up in business. So he had cut loose from the charlatan and had opened his dental parlors on Polk Street, an accommodation street of small shops in the residence quarter of the town. Here he had slowly collected a clientele of butcher boys, shop girls, drug clerks, and car conductors. He made but few acquaintances. Polk Street called him the Doctor, and spoke of his enormous strength. For McTeague was a young giant, carrying his huge shock of blond hair 6 feet 3 inches from the ground, moving his immense limbs, heavy with ropes of muscle, slowly, ponderously. His hands were enormous, red, and covered with a fell of stiff yellow hair. They were as hard as wooden mallets, strong as vices, the hands of the old-time car-boy. Often he dispensed with forceps and extracted a refractory tooth with his thumb and finger. His head was square-cut, angular, the jaw salient, like that of the carnivora. But for one thing McTeague would have been perfectly contented. Just outside his window was his signboard, a modest affair, that read, "Dr. McTeague, Dental Parlors, Gas Given." But that was all. It was his ambition, his dream, to have projecting from that corner window a huge gilded tooth, a molar with enormous prongs, something gorgeous and attractive. He would have it some day, but as yet it was far beyond his means. Then Mr. Norris launches into a description of the street in which McTeague lives. He presents that street as it is on Sunday, as it is on working days, as it is in the early dawn when the workmen are going out with pickaxes on their shoulders, as it is at 10 o'clock when the women are out purchasing from the small shopkeepers, as it is at night when the shop-girls are out with the soda-fountain tenders, and the motor-cars dash by full of theatre-goers, and the Salvationists sing before the saloon on the corner. In 4 pages he reproduces the life in a by-street of a great city, the little tragedy of the small shopkeeper. There are many ways of handling environment, most of them bad. When a young author has very little to say and no story worth telling, he resorts to environment. It is frequently used to disguise a weakness of structure, as ladies who paint landscapes put their cows knee-deep in water to conceal the defective drawing of the legs. But such description as one meets throughout Mr. Norris's book is in itself convincing proof of power, imagination, and literary skill. It is a positive and active force, stimulating the reader's imagination, giving him an actual command, a realizing sense of this world into which he is suddenly transplanted. It gives to the book perspective, atmosphere, effects of time and distance, creates the illusion of life. This power of mature and accurate and comprehensive description is very unusual among the younger American writers. Most of them observe the world through a temperament and are more occupied with their medium than the objects they see. And temperament is a glass which distorts most astonishingly. But this young man sees with a clear eye, and reproduces with a firm touch, and decisive, strong, almost to brutalness. Yet this hand that can depict so powerfully the brute strength and brute passions of a McTeague can deal very finely and adroitly with the feminine element of his story. This is his portrait of the little Swiss girl, Trina, whom the dentist marries. Trina was very small and prettily made. Her face was round and rather pale, her eyes long and narrow and blue, like the half-opened eyes of a baby. Her lips and the lobes of her tiny ears were pale, a little suggestive of anemia, but it was to her hair that one's attention was most attracted. Heaps and heaps of blue-black coils and braids, a royal crown of swarthy bands, a veritable sable tiara, heavy, abundant, and odorous. All the vitality that should have given color to her face seemed to have been absorbed by that marvelous hair. It was the coiffure of a queen that shadowed the temples of this little bourgeois. The tragedy of the story dates from a chance, a seeming stroke of good fortune, one of those terrible gifts of the Danai. A few weeks before her marriage, Trina drew $5,000 from a lottery ticket. From that moment her passion for hoarding money becomes the dominant theme of the story, takes command of the book and its characters. After their marriage, the dentist is disbarred from practice. They move into a garret where she starves her husband and herself to save that precious hoard. She sells even his office furniture, everything but his concertina and his canary bird, with which he stubbornly refuses to part, and which are destined to become very important accessories in the property room of the theatre where this drama is played. This removal from their first home is to this story what Gervaise's removal from her shop is to L'Assommoir. It is the fatal episode of the third act, the sacrifice of self-respect, the beginning of the end. From that time the money stands between Trina and her husband. Outraged and humiliated, hating her for her meanness, demoralized by his idleness and despair, he begins to abuse her. The story becomes a careful and painful study of the disintegration of this union, a penetrating and searching analysis of the degeneration of these two souls, the woman's corroded by greed, the man's poisoned by disappointment and hate. And all the while this same painful theme is placed in a lower key. Maria, the housemaid who took care of McTeague's dental parlors in his better days, was a half-crazy girl from somewhere in Central America, she herself did not remember just where. But she had a wonderful story about her people owning a dinner service of pure gold with a punch bowl you could scarcely lift, which rang like a church bell when you struck it. On the strength of this story, Zerkow, the Jew junkman, marries her, and, believing that she knows where this treasure is hidden, bullies and tortures her to force her to disclose her secret. At last, Maria is found with her throat cut, and Zerkow is picked up by the wharf with a sack full of rusty tin cans, which in his dementia he must have thought the fabled dinner service of gold. From this it is a short step to McTeague's crime. He kills his wife to get possession of her money, and escapes to the mountains. While he is on his way south, pushing toward Mexico, he is overtaken by his murdered wife's cousin and former suitor. Both men are half mad with thirst, and there in the desert wastes of Death's Valley they spring to their last conflict. The cousin falls, but before he dies he slips a handcuff over McTeague's arm, and so the author leaves his hero in the wastes of Death's Valley, 100 miles from water, with a dead man chained to his arm. As he stands there, the canary bird, the survivor of his happier days, to which he had clung with stubborn affection, begins chittering feebly in its little gilt prison. It reminds one a little of Stevenson's use of poor Goddedaal's canary in The Wrecker. It is just such sharp, sure strokes that bring out the high lights in a story and separate excellence from the commonplace. They are at once dramatic and revelatory. Lacking them, a novel which may otherwise be a good one lacks its chief reason for being. The fault with many worthy attempts at fiction lies not in what they are, but in what they are not. Mr. Norris's model, if he will admit that he has followed one, is clearly no less a person than Monsieur Zola himself. Yet there is no discoverable trace of imitation in his book. He has simply taken a method which has been most successfully applied in the study of French life, and applied it in studying American life, as one uses certain algebraic formulae to solve certain problems. It is perhaps the only truthful literary method of dealing with that part of society which environment and heredity hedge about like the walls of a prison. It is true that Mr. Norris now and then allows his method to become too prominent, that his restraint savors of constraint, yet he has written a true story of the people, courageous, dramatic, full of matter and warm with life. He has addressed himself seriously to art, and he seems to have no ambition to be clever. His horizon is wide, his invention vigorous and bold, his touch heavy and warm and human. This man is not limited by literary prejudices. He sees the people as they are, he is close to them, and not afraid of their unloveliness. He has looked at truth in the depths, among men begrimed by toil and besotted by ignorance, and still found her fair. McTeague is an achievement for a young man. It may not win at once the success which it deserves, but Mr. Norris is one of those who can afford to wait. The Courier, April 8, 1899. If you want to read a story that is all wheat and no chaff, read Blix. Last winter that brilliant young Californian, Mr. Norris, published a remarkable and gloomy novel, McTeague, a book deep in insight, rich in promise, and splendid in execution, but entirely without charm, and as disagreeable as only a great piece of work can be. And now this gentleman, who is not yet 30, turns around and gives us an idyll that sings through one's brain like a summer wind, and makes one feel young enough to commit all manner of indiscretions. It may be that Mr. Norris is desirous of showing us his versatility, and that he can follow any suit, or it may have been a process of reaction. I believe it was after Monsieur Zola had completed one of his greatest and darkest novels of Parisian life that he went down to the seaside and wrote La Rêve, a book that every girl should read when she is 18, and then again when she is 80. Powerful and solidly built as McTeague is, one felt that their method was carried almost too far, that Mr. Norris was too consciously influenced by his French masters. But Blix belongs to no school whatever, and there is not a shadow of pedantry or pride of craft in it from cover to cover. Blix herself is the method, the motives, and the aim of the book. The story is an exhalation of youth and spring. It is the work of a man who breaks loose and forgets himself. Mr. Norris was married only last summer, and the march from Lohengrin is simply sticking out all over Blix. It is the story of a San Francisco newspaper man and a girl. The newspaper man came out in fiction, so to speak, in the drawing-room of Mr. Richard Harding Davis, and has languished under that gentleman's chaperonage until he has come to be regarded as a fellow careful of nothing but his toilette and his dinner. Mr. Davis's reporters all bathed regularly and all ate nice things, but beyond that their tastes were rather colorless. I am glad to see one red-blooded newspaper man in the person of Landy Rivers of San Francisco break into fiction. A real live reporter with no sentimental loyalty for his paper, and no Byronic poses about his vices, and no astonishing taste about his clothes, and no money whatever, which is the natural and normal condition of all reporters. Blix herself was just a society girl, and Landy took her to theatres and parties, and tried to make himself believe he was in love with her. But it wouldn't work, for Landy couldn't love a society girl, not though she were as beautiful as the morning, and terrible as an army with banners, and had round full arms, and the skin of her face was white and clean, except where it flushed into a most charming pink upon her smooth, cool cheeks. For while Landy Rivers was at college he had been seized with the penchant for writing short stories, and had worshipped at the shrines of Maupassant and Kipling, and when a man is craft-mad enough to worship Maupassant truly and know him well, when he has that tingling for technique in his fingers, not Aphrodite herself, new risen from the waves, could tempt him into any world where craft was not lord and king. So it happened that their real love affair never began until one morning when Landy had to go down to the wharf to write up a whaleback, and Blix went along, and an old sailor told them a story, and Blix recognized the literary possibilities of it, and they had lunch in a Chinese restaurant, and Landy, because he was a newspaper man, and it was the end of the week, didn't have any change about his clothes, and Blix had to pay the bill. And it was in that green old tea-house that Landy read Blix one of his favorite yarns by Kipling, and she in a calm, off-handed way recognized one of the fine technical points in it, and Landy almost went to pieces for joy of her doing it. That scene in the Chinese restaurant is one of the prettiest bits of color you'll find to rest your eyes upon, and mighty good writing it is. I wonder, though, if when Mr. Norris adroitly mentioned the clack and snarl of the banjo Landy played, he remembered the silver snarling trumpets of Keats. After that, things went on as such things will, and Blix quit the society racket and went to queer places with Landy, and got interested in his work, and she broke him of wearing red neckties and playing poker, and she made him work, she did, for she grew to realize how much that meant to him, and she jacked him up when he didn't work, and she suggested an ending for one of his stories that was better than his own. Just this big, splendid girl who had never gone to college to learn how to write novels. And so how, in the name of goodness, could he help loving her? So one morning, down by the Pacific with Blix and the Seven Seas, it all came over Landy that living was better than reading, and life was better than literature. And so it is. Once and only once for each of us, and that is the tune that sings and sings through one's head when one puts the book away. The Courier, January 13, 1900. An Heir Apparent. Last winter a young Californian, Mr. Frank Norris, published a novel with the unpretentious title of McTeague, A Story of San Francisco. It was a book that could not be ignored nor dismissed with a word. There was something very unusual about its solidity and mass, the thoroughness and firmness of texture, and it came down like a blow from a sledge-hammer among the slighter and more sprightly performances of the hour. The most remarkable thing about the book was its maturity and compactness. It has none of the earmarks of those entertaining young writers whom every season produces as inevitably as its debutantes, young men who surprise for an hour and then settle down to producing industriously for the class with which their peculiar trick of phrase has found favor. It was a book addressed to the American people and to the critics of the world, the work of a young man who had set himself to the art of authorship with an almighty seriousness and who had no ambition to be clever. McTeague was not an experiment in style, nor a pretty piece of romantic folly. It was a true story of the people, having about it, as M. Zola would say, the smell of the people, courageous, dramatic, full of matter, and warm with life. It was realism of the most uncompromising kind. The theme was such that the author could not have expected sudden popularity for his book, such as sometimes overtakes monstrosities of style in these discouraging days when knighthood is in flower to the extent of 250,000 copies, nor could he have hoped for pressing commissions from the fireside periodicals. The life story of a quack dentist who sometimes extracted molars with his fingers, who mistreated and finally murdered his wife, is not in itself attractive. But, after all, the theme counts for very little. Every newspaper contains the essential subject matter for another comédie humaine. The important point is that a man considerably under 30 could take up a subject so grim and unattractive, and that, for the mere love of doing things well, he was able to hold himself down to the task of developing it completely, that he was able to justify this quack's existence in literature, to thrust this hairy blonde dentist with the salient jaw of the carnivora in amongst the immortals. It was after M. Zola had completed one of the greatest and gloomiest of his novels of Parisian life that he went down to the sea and wrote Le Rêve, that tender adolescent story of love and purity and youth. So, almost simultaneously with McTeague, Mr. Norris published Blix, another San Francisco story, as short as McTeague was lengthy, as light as McTeague was heavy, as poetic and graceful as McTeague was somber and charmless. Here is a man worth waiting on, a man who is both realist and poet, a man who can teach, not only by a comet's rush, but by a rose's birth. Yet, unlike as they are, in both books the source of power is the same, and for that matter it was even the same in his first book, Moran of the Lady Letty. Mr. Norris has dispensed with the conventional symbols that have crept into art, with the trite half-truths and circumlocutions, and got back to the physical basis of things. He has abjured tea-table psychology and the analysis of figures in the carpet and subtle dissections of intellectual impotencies, and the diverting game of words and the whole literature of the nerves. He is big and warm and sometimes brutal, and the strength of the soil comes up to him with very little loss in the transmission. His art strikes deep down into the roots of life and the foundation of things as they are, not as we tell each other they are at the tea-table. But he is realistic art, not artistic realism. He is courageous, but he is without bravado. He sees things freshly, as though they had not been seen before, and describes them with singular directness and vividness, not with morbid acuteness, with a large, wholesome joy of life. Nowhere is this more evident than in his insistent use of environment. I recall the passage in which he describes the street in which McTeague lives. He represents that street as it is on Sunday, as it is on working days, as it is in the early dawn when the workmen are going out with pickaxes on their shoulders, as it is at 10 o'clock when the women are out marketing among the small shopkeepers, as it is at night when the shop-girls are out with the soda-fountain tenders and the motor-cars dash by full of theatre-goers, and the Salvationists sing before the saloon on the corner. In 4 pages he reproduces in detail the life in a by-street of a great city, the little tragedy of the small shopkeeper. There are many ways of handling environment, most of them bad. When a young author has very little to say and no story worth telling, he resorts to environment. It is frequently used to disguise a weakness of structure, as ladies who paint landscapes put their cows knee-deep in water to conceal the defective drawing of the legs. But such description as one meets throughout Mr. Norris's book is in itself convincing proof of power, imagination, and literary skill. It is a positive and active force, stimulating the reader's imagination, giving him an actual command, a realizing sense of this world into which he is suddenly transported. It gives to the book perspective, atmosphere, effects of time and distance, creates the illusion of life. This power of mature and comprehensive description is very unusual among the younger American writers. Most of them observe the world through a temperament, and are more occupied with their medium than the objects they watch. And temperament is a glass which distorts most astonishingly. But this young man sees with a clear eye, and reproduces with a touch, firm and decisive, strong almost to brutalness. Mr. Norris approaches things on their physical side. His characters are personalities of flesh before they are anything else, types before they are individuals. Especially is this true of his women. His Trina is very small and prettily made. Her face was round and rather pale, her eyes long and narrow and blue, like the half-opened eyes of a baby. Her lips and the lobes of her tiny ears were pale, a little suggestive of anemia, but it was to her hair that one's attention was most attracted. Heaps and heaps of blue-black coils and braids, a royal crown of swarthy bands, a veritable sable tiara, heavy, abundant, and odorous. All the vitality that should have given color to her face seems to have been absorbed by that marvelous hair. It was the coiffure of a queen that shadowed the temples of this little bourgeois. Blix had round, full arms, and the skin of her face was white and clean, except where it flushed into a most charming pink upon her smooth, cool cheeks. In this grasp of the element of things, this keen, clean, frank pleasure at color and odor and warmth, this candid admission of the negative of beauty, which is coexistent with and inseparable from it, lie much of his power and promise. Here is a man, catholic enough to include the extremes of physical and moral life, strong enough to handle the crudest colors and darkest shadows. Here is a man who has an appetite for the physical universe, who loves the rank smells of crowded alleyways, or the odors of boudoirs, or the delicate perfume exhaled from a woman's skin, who is not afraid of Pan, be he ever so shaggy and redolent of the herd. Structurally, where most young novelists are weak, Mr. Norris is very strong. He has studied the best French masters, and he has adopted their methods quite simply, as one selects an algebraic formula to solve his particular problem. As to his style, that is, as expression always is, just as vigorous as his thought compels it to be, just as vivid as his conception warrants. If God Almighty has given a man ideas, he will get himself a style from one source or another. Mr. Norris, fortunately, is not a conscious stylist. He has too much to say to be exquisitely vain about his medium. He has the kind of brain stuff that would vanquish difficulties in any profession, that might be put to building battleships, or solving problems of finance, or to devising colonial policies. Let us be thankful that he has put it to literature. Let us be thankful, moreover, that he is not introspective, and that his intellect does not devour itself, but feeds upon the great race of man, and above all, let us rejoice that he is not a temperamental artist, but something larger, for a great brain and an assertive temperament seldom dwell together. There are clever men enough in the field of American letters, and the fault of most of them is merely one of magnitude. They are not large enough. They travel in small orbits. They play on muted strings. They sing neither of the combats of Atrides nor the labors of Cadmus, but of the tea-table and the Odyssey of the Rialto. Flaubert said that a drop of water contained all the elements of the sea, save one, immensity. Mr. Norris is concerned only with serious things. He has only large ambitions. His brush is bold, his color is taken fresh from the kindly earth, his canvas is large enough to hold American life, the real life of the people. He has come into the court of the troubadours, singing the song of Elise, the song of warm, full nature. He has struck the true note of the common life. He is what Mr. Norman Hapgood said the great American dramatist must be, a large human being with a firm stomach who knows and loves the people. The Courier, April 7, 1900. End of Part 27. Part 28 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 28. When I Knew Stephen Crane. It was, I think, in the spring of '94 that a slender, narrow-chested fellow in a shabby gray suit with a soft felt hat pulled low over his eyes sauntered into the office of the managing editor of the Nebraska State Journal and introduced himself as Stephen Crane. He stated that he was going to Mexico to do some work for the Bachelors' Syndicate and get rid of his cough, and that he would be stopping in Lincoln for a few days. Later he explained that he was out of money and would be compelled to wait until he got a check from the East before he went further. I was a junior in the Nebraska State University at the time, and was doing some work for the State Journal in my leisure time, and I happened to be in the managing editor's room when Mr. Crane introduced himself. I was just off the range. I knew a little Greek and something about cattle and a good horse when I saw one, and beyond horses and cattle I considered nothing of vital importance except good stories and the people who wrote them. This was the first man of letters I had ever met in the flesh, and when the young man announced who he was, I dropped into a chair behind the editor's desk where I could stare at him without being too much in evidence. Only a very youthful enthusiasm and a large propensity for hero worship could have found anything impressive in the young man who stood before the managing editor's desk. He was thin to emaciation, his face was gaunt and unshaven, a thin dark mustache straggled on his upper lip, his black hair grew low on his forehead and was shaggy and unkempt. His gray clothes were much the worse for wear and fitted him so badly it seemed unlikely he had ever been measured for them. He wore a flannel shirt and a slovenly apology for a necktie, and his shoes were dusty and worn gray about the toes and were badly run over at the heel. I had seen many a tramp printer come up the journal stairs to hunt a job, but never one who presented such a disreputable appearance as this story-maker man. He wore gloves, which seemed rather a contradiction to the general slovenliness of his attire, but when he took them off to search his pockets for his credentials, I noticed that his hands were singularly fine, long, white, and delicately shaped, with thin, nervous fingers. I have seen pictures of Aubrey Beardsley's hands that recalled Crane's very vividly. At that time Crane was but 24 and almost an unknown man. Hamlin Garland had seen some of his work and believed in him, and had introduced him to Mr. Howells, who recommended him to the Bachelor Syndicate. The Red Badge of Courage had been published in the State Journal that winter along with a lot of other syndicate matter, and the grammatical construction of the story was so faulty that the managing editor had several times called on me to edit the copy. In this way I had read it very carefully, and through the careless sentence structure I saw the wonder of that remarkable performance. But the grammar certainly was bad. I remember one of the reporters, who had corrected the phrase "it don't" for the 10th time, remarked savagely, "If I couldn't write better English than this, I'd quit." Crane spent several days in the town, living from hand to mouth and waiting for his money. I think he borrowed a small amount from the managing editor. He lounged about the office most of the time, and I frequently encountered him going in and out of the cheap restaurants on 10th Street. When he was at the office he talked a great deal in a wandering, absent-minded fashion, and his conversation was uniformly frivolous. If he could not evade a serious question by a joke, he bolted. I cut my classes to lie in wait for him, confident that in some unwary moment I could trap him into serious conversation, that if one burned incense long enough and ardently enough, the oracle would not be dumb. I was Maupassant mad at the time, a malady particularly unattractive in a junior, and I made a frantic effort to get an expression of opinion from him on Le Bonheur. "Oh, you're moping, are you?" he remarked with a sarcastic grin, and went on reading a little volume of Poe that he carried in his pocket. At another time I cornered him in the funny man's room, and succeeded in getting a little out of him. We were taught literature by an exceedingly analytical method at the university, and we probably distorted the method, and I was busy trying to find the least common multiple of Hamlet and the greatest common divisor of Macbeth, and I began asking him whether stories were constructed by cabalistic formulae. At length he sighed wearily and shook his drooping shoulders, remarking, "Where did you get all that rot? Yarns aren't done by mathematics. You can't do it by rule any more than you can dance by rule. You have to have the itch of the thing in your fingers, and if you haven't, well, you're damned lucky, and you'll live long and prosper, that's all." And with that he yawned and went down the hall. Crane was moody most of the time. His health was bad, and he seemed profoundly discouraged. Even his jokes were exceedingly drastic. He went about with the tense, preoccupied, self-centered air of a man who is brooding over some impending disaster, and I conjectured vainly as to what it might be. Though he was seemingly entirely idle during the few days I knew him, his manner indicated that he was in the throes of work that told terribly on his nerves. His eyes I remember as the finest I have ever seen, large and dark and full of lustre and changing lights, but with a profound melancholy always lurking deep in them. They were eyes that seemed to be burning themselves out. As he sat at the desk with his shoulders drooping forward, his head low and his long white fingers drumming on the sheets of copy paper, he was as nervous as a racehorse fretting to be on the track. Always, as he came and went about the halls, he seemed like a man preparing for a sudden departure. Now that he is dead, it occurs to me that all his life was a preparation for sudden departure. I remember once when he was writing a letter, he stopped and asked me about the spelling of a word, saying carelessly, "I haven't time to learn to spell." Then, glancing down at his attire, he added with an absent-minded smile, "I haven't time to dress, either. It takes an awful slice out of a fellow's life." He said he was poor, and he certainly looked it, but 4 years later, when he was in Cuba, drawing the largest salary ever paid a newspaper correspondent, he clung to this same untidy manner of dress, and his ragged overalls and buttonless shirt were eyesores to the immaculate Mr. Davis in his spotless linen and neat khaki uniform, with his Gibson chin always freshly shaven. When I first heard of his serious illness, his old throat trouble aggravated into consumption by his reckless exposure in Cuba, I recalled a passage from Maeterlinck's essay, The Predestined, on those doomed to early death. As children, life seems nearer to them than to other children. They appear to know nothing, and yet there is in their eyes so profound a certainty that we feel they must know all. In all haste, but wisely and with minute care do they prepare themselves to live, and this very haste is a sign upon which mothers can scarce bring themselves to look. I remembered, too, the young man's melancholy, and his tenseness, his burning eyes, and his way of slurring over the less important things, as one whose time is short. I have heard other people say how difficult it was to induce Crane to talk seriously about his work, and I suspect that he was particularly averse to discussions with literary men of wider education and better equipment than himself. Yet he seemed to feel that this fuller culture was not for him. Perhaps the unreasoning instinct which lies deep in the roots of our lives, and which guides us all, told him that he had not time enough to acquire it. Men will sometimes reveal themselves to children, or to people whom they think never to see again, more completely than they ever do to their confrères. From the wise we hold back alike our folly and our wisdom, and for the recipients of our deeper confidences we seldom select our equals. The soul has no message for the friends with whom we dine every week. It is silenced by custom and convention, and we play only in the shadows. It selects its listeners wilfully, and seemingly delights to waste its best upon the chance wayfarer who meets us in the highway at a fated hour. There are moments, too, when the tides run high or very low, when self-revelation is necessary to every man, if it be only to his valet or his gardener. At such a moment I was with Mr. Crane. The hoped-for revelation came unexpectedly enough. It was on the last night he spent in Lincoln. I had come back from the theatre, and was in the Journal office writing a notice of the play. It was 11 o'clock when Crane came in. He had expected his money to arrive on the night mail, and it had not done so, and he was out of sorts and deeply despondent. He sat down on the ledge of the open window that faced on the street, and when I had finished my notice I went over and took a chair beside him. Quite without invitation on my part, Crane began to talk, began to curse his trade from the first throb of creative desire in a boy to the finished work of the master. The night was oppressively warm. One of those dry winds that are the curse of that country was blowing up from Kansas. The white western moonlight threw sharp blue shadows below us. The streets were silent at that hour, and we could hear the gurgle of the fountain in the post-office square across the street, and the twang of banjos from the lower veranda of the Hotel Lincoln, where the colored waiters were serenading the guests. The drop lights in the office were dull under their green shades, and the telegraph sounder clicked faintly in the next room. In all his long tirade, Crane never raised his voice. He spoke slowly and monotonously, and even calmly, but I have never known so bitter a heart in any man as he revealed to me that night. It was an arraignment of the wages of life, an invocation to the ministers of hate. Incidentally, he told me the sum he had received for the Red Badge of Courage, which I think was something like $90, and he repeated some lines from The Black Riders, which was then in preparation. He gave me to understand that he led a double literary life, writing in the first place the matter that pleased himself, and doing it very slowly; in the second place any sort of stuff that would sell. And he remarked that his poor was just as bad as it could possibly be. He realized, he said, that his limitations were absolutely impassable. What I can't do, I can't do at all, and I can't acquire it. I only hold one trump. He had no settled plans at all. He was going to Mexico, wholly uncertain of being able to do any successful work there, and he seemed to feel very insecure about the financial end of his venture. The thing that most interested me was what he said about his slow method of composition. He declared that there was little money in story writing, at best, and practically none in it for him, because of the time it took him to work up his detail. Other men, he said, could sit down and write up an experience while the physical effect of it, so to speak, was still upon them, and yesterday's impressions made today's copy. But when he came in from the streets to write up what he had seen there, his faculties were benumbed, and he sat twirling his pencil and hunting for words like a schoolboy. I mentioned The Red Badge of Courage, which was written in 9 days, and he replied that though the writing took very little time, he had been unconsciously working the detail of the story out through most of his boyhood. His ancestors had been soldiers, and he had been imagining war stories ever since he was out of knickerbockers. And in writing his first war story, he had simply gone over his imaginary campaigns and selected his favorite imaginary experiences. He declared that his imagination was hidebound. It was there, but it pulled hard. After he got a notion for a story, months passed before he could get any sort of personal contract with it, or feel any potency to handle it. The detail of a thing has to filter through my blood, and then it comes out like a native product, but it takes forever, he remarked. I distinctly remember the illustration, for it rather took hold of me. I have often been astonished since to hear Crane spoken of as the reporter in fiction, for the reportorial faculty of superficial reception and quick transference was what he conspicuously lacked. His first newspaper account of a shipwreck on the filibuster Commodore off the Florida coast was as lifeless as the copy of a police court reporter. It was many months afterwards that the literary product of his terrible experience appeared in that marvelous sea story, The Open Boat, unsurpassed in its vividness and constructive perfection. At the close of our long conversation that night, when the copy boy came in to take me home, I suggested to Crane that in 10 years he would probably laugh at all his temporary discomfort. Again his body took on that strenuous tension, and he clenched his hands, saying, "I can't wait 10 years. I haven't time." The 10 years are not up yet, and he has done his work and gathered his reward and gone. Was ever so much experience and achievement crowded into so short a space of time? A great man dead at 29. That would have puzzled the ancients. Edward Garnett wrote of him in the Academy of December 17, 1899, "I cannot remember a parallel in the literary history of fiction. Maupassant, Meredith, Henry James, Mr. Howells, and Tolstoy were all learning their expression at an age where Crane had achieved his, and achieved it triumphantly. He had the precocity of those doomed to die in youth. I am convinced that when I met him he had a vague premonition of the shortness of his working day, and in the heart of the man there was that which said, 'That thou doest, do quickly.' At 21, this son of an obscure New Jersey rector, with but a scant reading knowledge of French and no training, had rivaled in technique the foremost craftsmen of the Latin races. In the 6 years since I met him, a stranded reporter, he stood in the firing line during 2 wars, knew hairbreadth escape on land and sea, and established himself as the first writer of his time in the picturing of episodic, fragmentary life. His friends have charged him with fickleness, but he was a man who was in the preoccupation of haste. He went from country to country, from man to man, absorbing all that was in them for him. He had no time to look backward. He had no leisure for camaraderie. He drank life to the lees, but at the banquet table where other men took their ease and jested over their wine, he stood a dark and silent figure, sombre as Poe himself, not wishing to be understood. And he took his portion in haste, with his loins girded and his shoes on his feet, and his staff in his hand, like one who must depart quickly. The Library, June 23, 1900. End of Part 28. Part 29 of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 29, On the Art of Fiction. One is sometimes asked about the obstacles that confront young writers who are trying to do good work. I should say the greatest obstacles that writers today have to get over are the dazzling journalistic successes of 20 years ago. Stories that surprised and delighted by their sharp photographic detail and that were really nothing more than lively pieces of reporting. The whole aim of that school of writing was novelty, never a very important thing in art. They gave us, altogether, poor standards, taught us to multiply our ideas instead of to condense them. They tried to make a story out of every theme that occurred to them, and to get returns on every situation that suggested itself. They got returns of a kind, but their work, when one looks back on it, now that the novelty upon which they counted so much is gone, is journalistic and thin. The especial merit of a good repertorial story is that it shall be intensely interesting and pertinent today, and shall have lost its point by tomorrow. Art, it seems to me, should simplify. That, indeed, is very nearly the whole of the higher artistic process, finding what conventions of form and what detail one can do without, and yet preserve the spirit of the whole, so that all that one has suppressed and cut away is there to the reader's consciousness as much as if it were in type on the page. Millet had done hundreds of sketches of peasants sowing grain, some of them very complicated and interesting, but when he came to paint the spirit of them all into one picture, The Sower, the composition is so simple that it seems inevitable. All the discarded sketches that went before made the picture what it finally became, and the process was all the time one of simplifying, of sacrificing many conceptions good in themselves for one that was better and more universal. Any first-rate novel or story must have in it the strength of a dozen fairly good stories that have been sacrificed to it. A good workman can't be a cheap workman. He can't be stingy about wasting material, and he cannot compromise. Writing ought either to be the manufacture of stories for which there is a market demand, a business as safe and commendable as making soap or breakfast foods, or it should be an art, which is always a search for something for which there is no market demand, something new and untried, where the values are intrinsic and have nothing to do with standardized values. The courage to go on without compromise does not come to a writer all at once, nor, for that matter, does the ability. Both are phases of natural development. In the beginning, the artist, like his public, is wedded to old forms, old ideals, and his vision is blurred by the memory of old delights he would like to recapture. The Borzoi, 1920. End of Part 29. End of a collection of stories, reviews, and essays by Willa Sibert CATHER.